Good evening, everyone. If you could please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good evening, everyone. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the BET for October 2009. Randall Huffman, just to take a brief moment, wish to address the BET on an item.
Thank you. I just wanted to alert all of you that on Friday, as you may know, the Board of Selectmen adopted a resolution approving a community covenant of care for military service people and their families. And we have tonight copies, if you wish, of a flyer that is descriptive of the signing ceremony and the intent of this resolution and covenant that will be available for people to participate in on November 1st. If any of you wish it, I have copies of it here that I will leave and you can see it. We are very pleased at the support that we're already receiving. As you may have seen, it had an article in this morning's Greenwich Time. And we feel that this is an activity that the town can welcome and can strongly support for those who are serving us across the world. Thank you.
Item 2 now comes before us, which is the public hearing for our Community Development Block Grant for 2010. This is the first increment of the new 5-year consolidated plan. With us tonight is Princess Urfe, who oversees the Community Development Block Grant process in Greenwich. It's customary that we leave, first of all, is there anybody who wishes to speak on this item? Customarily, we leave the public hearing portion open for at least a period of time so that if anybody does wish to address us on this matter. So this public hearing will be left open for a brief period of time. Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move that we take the non-routine items which relate to the Community Development Block Grant up after the assessors report.
This motion been made, seconded by Mr. Stone, to take items out of order to allow the necessary time for the public hearing on the Community Development Block Grant. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? I think we're 11 tonight. Mr. Mason is out on a business venture. Very well.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. I think we should at least allow the committee not to close it before 7 o'clock. The public hearing. I mean, we could zip through this pretty quick.
Is there any objection to that amendment, that we just take it up at the next time after 7 p.m.? I think that's fine. Okay. Routine applications now come before us. Madam Clerk.
Routine applications. I move HD2 for the Department of Health, approval to use $26,493.
Second.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington, second by Mr. Stone.
We can do these all together.
Yes. Ms.
I want
Tarkington?
to do them all together. HD3, Department of Health, approval to use $8,276. PR2, Parks and Recreation, $100,000. Additional appropriation for $100,000. SE4, First Selectman, transfer of $3,500. And again, I so move.
Second.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington, second by Mr. Stone. Discussion. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. These next items say routine applications, but I think at some point we should at least have some comment from the Law Committee. But Ms. Tarkington, why don't you place them before us and then we'll take it up.
Not one of the Law Committee?
unless one of the law committee members wishes to initially present this before the BET. Okay, Mr. Campbell.
SE 5 from the First Selectman's Office. It's an additional appropriation settlement in the amount of $7,500 in the matter of Kerrigan versus the Town of Greenwich et al. And SE 6 from the First Selectman's Office, an additional appropriation self-retention in the amount of $1,300, a property damage claim related to the same case, and I so move both items.
Moved by Mr. Campbell.
Second.
Second by Ms. Barton. My understanding is that if there is significant or really any discussion on the merits of these cases, we would need to go into executive session to address these items. They have been brought before us as routine applications based on the informal policy of the BET if it's been reviewed by the law committee and under the threshold amount. These are both coming, though, from the risk fund, correct, Roland? No, they're not?
That's what it's for.
SU6 is coming from the fixed charge on self-retention.
Further discussion,
Mr. Chairman, I'm prepared to say a few words about each.
please.
In the first matter, SE 5, again, that's Kerrigan versus the Town of Greenwich. This is a proposed settlement amount of $7,500 that will be payable to the plaintiff. It's related to a personal injury case that arose out of a motor vehicle accident in December of 2006. It involved multiple vehicles, including a town vehicle being driven by a town employee while on town business. The Law Committee met on October 15th and approved the proposed settlement by a vote of 2-0. If I could continue in the matter of SE 6, the property damage claim is related to this same case. Here, the proposed settlement amount of $1,300 is payable to the co-defendant. This damage claim is for damage to the plaintiff's vehicle. It represents a proposed settlement between the town and the insurance company for a co-defendant in the action. But the settlement amount representing a portion of the damages the co-defendant has already paid with respect to damage to the plaintiff's vehicle. Again, at the October 15th meeting of the Law Committee, the committee approved the proposed settlement by a vote of 2-0.
For purposes of our vote, why don't we take them separately, just so that there's a clear record of the votes taken on these. So, any further discussion on SE 5? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. Further discussion on SE 6? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. Item 4 now comes before us, the assessor's report. Our town assessor, Ted Courtney, Assistant Town Assessor, Bob Shimon. Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. You have my report. In summary, we are in the process now of wrapping up the work for the grand list for 2009, and we're making progress in that direction. We're also recommending that the BET approve proceeding with the revaluation for the year 2010. I'd be glad to answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, so before we get into the report, this will be what I guess we'll consider is the first reading of your recommendation to proceed. We do have a special project team that's assigned for the reval, and Mr. Simon and Ms. Tarkington. So I guess the proper procedure, if anybody does have questions regarding whether or not to proceed or not to proceed, if you have questions, that they probably should go through the finance department to the special project team, and that way, whether a meeting is set up or just questions are asked, I think that'll be an orderly process, and we'll then put this on the agenda under your report for our November meeting. Okay? So with that, I just had one question relative. You entered into one court stipulation in Section 4 of the agreement and one withdrawal.
Yes.
Can you, without necessarily describing the property, just give us a little bit more flavor for that one stipulation?
The one stipulation was a major, well-known property that agreed to stipulate its value, and it was a very sizable amount, around $70,000, $70 million.
Okay. Other questions for the assessor? It will also be before us. My understanding is that the senior tax, make sure I get the deferral proposal, will by our November meeting be presented before us.
Yes.
To the extent, and I know there was some serious discussion in the Budget Committee meeting as to getting a chance to look at that before it was actually voted upon by the Board of Selectmen. I think that information, in fact, I know that information was provided to BET members. And so if you do have questions or concerns, those should then go through the committee, either through you as one of our representatives, or Ms. Barton, who actually serves on the committee as well. And then we would take it up upon its ratification, if in fact it is ratified by the Board of Selectmen at our November meeting. But I would anticipate that not only would Ms. Barton be here, obviously, to answer any questions, but to the extent that there are technical questions, that you also be available, which I know you will be, to answer any questions. And I know Mr. Crary will be present next month also to help facilitate that discussion. So I figure between the three of you, plus I'm sure some others, will at least have the information enough to make an informed decision at that time.
Yes.
Mr. Simon.
A couple of things on the chart on number 4, under litigation on page 2.
Yes.
The revised column is incorrect, I think. Because this is just the same as the 2005 values and doesn't really contain the revised value as a result of the stipulations. Because I have last month's chart,
You're right.
and so that would help us.
Yes.
And I, having spent all this time looking to make sure the chart was wrong, missed the conversation on the senior tax relief. So it was passed at a first hearing at the Board of Selectmen?
It was heard at the meeting, and we
It was heard.
comments from.
And when is the next meeting?
Our next regular meeting is November 19th.
Which is when this is going to be discussed?
Will be voted upon.
It's subsequent to our meeting.
Or a special meeting, but it will take place before your meeting.
When's our meeting in November? When?
Where's their calendar ready? The 17th?
Third is a Tuesday.
The 16th is our next BET meeting.
Thank you, Jeff.
So we will have to do a special meeting in order to have a decision prior to your acting on it.
Okay.
And then if I apologize for asking this. So if I have concerns or questions, I should send them to the 3 people you mentioned?
That would be my suggestion.
And include the members of the Board of Selectmen.
I'll send them to the 3 you mentioned and 3 more. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Mr. Kelly?
Could I at some point get a game plan? And maybe the best thing would be if the 2005, 6, and 7, and 8 cases that are still outstanding. We keep seeing them. I think
Expectation of when I could see them off my chart.
I use it. All right. Just when I would see them finally go away. And I don't need to ask the question now, but maybe the law committee could meet with the law department and just find out what the game plan is. Whether these are cases that are going to go on for another 4 years, 3 years, 2 years, or is there a way to bring them to resolution?
Yes, that would be an appropriate question to ask the law committee, to ask the law department.
Do I ask you, Steve, to do that?
It's just done.
We'll be happy to ask the question. We have not historically been blessed with reviews of the revaluation case settlements, and we would be delighted to get involved in that process.
I just think it was great that the town assessor thought it was a great idea that the law committee did it. So
I share his view.
Other questions for the town assessor? Great, thank you. Is there a motion to approve the town assessor's report?
So moved.
Can I move to that end now?
All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0.
I'm sorry, who seconded? Simon. Simon did.
Item 5 now comes before us, BET committees and special project team reports. In your packet, you should have received an audit committee report, an OPEB trust and ad hoc OPEB committee report, investment advisory committee report, and then provided for you should have been a Nathaniel Witherell Town Building Committee report and a Human Resources Committee report. And at this point, before I open up for any questions regarding those reports, Mr. Norton has asked to be recognized to discuss the Glenville School Building Committee report.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Glenville School Building Committee will have its October meeting tomorrow morning. And there have been extensive emails in the last couple of days regarding that meeting. And I asked our chairman if I could speak briefly to bring the committee up to date as to where we stand. At this point in time, where, according to the report from Turner Construction Company, we're 95% through the punch list. And at the present time, we have a contingency balance of roughly $368,000. The TCO process is ongoing. Last Friday, the fire marshal granted TCO approval. And this week, they're expecting to receive the plumbing as well as the electrical approvals. At least they are being inspected by both those areas. The TCO projection has been October 30th, and that is probably not going to be met because there is an issue with some railings, actually 25 feet of railings outside the front of the building, which will not be installed before the 6th of November. And they are required by federal accessibility code, so that they have to be installed and they have to be approved. And the expectation is, because they have to be galvanized, they won't be delivered on site until the first week in November, and subsequently installed during that week. And one other item that I'd like to bring to your attention is that the photovoltaic panels are scheduled to be delivered on Wednesday with the completion schedule for the 25th of November. Subsequent to our meeting last month, there was a meeting, I believe, in the building department with Bill Marr, John Crary, and Frank Mazur, in which it was indicated that the installation of the photovoltaic panels will not specifically impede granting the TCO, provided it does not affect any safety issues ongoing at the school at the time. But the completion for that is now scheduled for November 25th, which I believe is the day before Thanksgiving. That concludes my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Norton. Other or questions for any of the other committee reports?
Mr. Chairman, can I make one comment in regard to the audit committee report? I'd like to bring to everybody's attention action that the audit committee took in regard to the outstanding fire alarm issues, in which, at the request of the town attorney, the committee granted the request from the town attorney to institute small claims legal action against anybody who has outstanding false alarm fines. We did not take the same motion in regard to outstanding registration issues, because those are still not completely determined as to whether or not all the pending or outstanding registrations are accurate. Thank you.
I have one comment on that report.
Mr. Simon?
So is there a minimum amount?
No.
So if I have a $10 fine, we're going to small claims legal action?
Well, there's a $35 filing fee, and the $35 will be collected in addition to the $10, but there's no $10 fine.
So if I have a $50 fine, we're instituting a small claims legal action?
We're giving the town attorney authority to proceed. And I presume the town attorney, in his discretion, will decide if some of these are not worth pursuing in small claims court, but I don't believe there are any with that small, Larry.
How many residents are going to be affected by this? Roughly.
I think probably less than 50.
50 residents? Okay. I just want to make sure.
Mr. Finger?
I think the total outstanding balance was, if I'm not mistaken, about $38,000, $39,000. Just to clarify, what the town attorney explained to us was if he went to small claims, or somebody in the department the law department went to small claims, they would bring a small claims action against a number of delinquencies. So it wouldn't be going to small claims just to file a claim against somebody who owed $120, and we'd be spending time just on that 120. There'd be a whole, might have the terminology incorrectly, might have it incorrect, but it's the docket or the hearing calendar would have, whether it's 20 or 30, that would all basically be heard during the same period of time.
I just want to make sure we weren't going to be doing this to like 1,000 people.
No.
If you have violations out there, please pay them before the,
BET people will get a pre-notice.
other questions or comments regarding the committee reports? Okay, item 6 now comes before us. Comptroller's report.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, BET members. Just to follow up to that question, because it is in the Comptroller's report, although there isn't presently guidelines as far as collecting the unpaid fines, I think at a minimum there should be 2 guidelines. One, multiple offenders, or 3, multiple offenders with a minimum amount, and also they'd have to be delinquent for at least 90 days before you even think about going to small claims for it. So just a follow-up question, and you all have a copy of the Comptroller's report, and I'll answer any questions.
Questions for our comptroller?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I have one. It just occurred to me, Peter, you remember, and this was in connection with a case that came before the Budget Committee in an executive session, so I'm not going to specify which one, but the subject of an error in emissions policy was raised by me, and whether or not we had a rider along those lines. And you said you were going to look into that?
We did, and we did answer that. There's 2 policies, and forgive me for not remembering which applied. There was one policy that had a small deductible, which was specifically excluded the workers' comp claims.
Okay.
It was more for health care. And then there was another policy that was specifically included workers' comp claims, but had a self-insured retention of $1 million.
Okay.
So we lost on both counts.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, Mr. Minarski, you attached the tax collection review analysis, which I think is very good. But I was wondering if, for a future meeting, perhaps you could do an aging of these tax collections. So we have both a feel of how many people aren't paying on time, as well as maybe amounts not paid on time. So sort of the reverse of what's happening here, to sort of bring it down, just the current year, fiscal year. So, again, how many haven't been paid currently, and then an aging of those, 30, 60, 90 days, however long it goes, 1 year, 2 years?
Okay. Yes.
Thank you.
Well, but if you're only going to do the current year, they're all going to age from the same date.
Yeah, it's going to have to be multi-year to be effective.
Oh, I get
Larry's
it.
point is good.
Right.
I
no.
thought you were asking more
Right.
as far as number of years delinquent.
Well,
Not necessarily the traditional 30, 60, 90-day aging of receivables. I thought that your question applied to multiple years in arrears as far as owing.
I think probably having, like a 30, 60, 90 and spreading it out, as I agree, with the multiple years too. So you have a feeling for how many are still outstanding and for how long.
Okay.
Thank you.
Other questions for the comptroller? Okay. Is there a motion to approve the comptroller's report?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Finger, second by Mr. Kelly. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? The treasurer's report now comes before us. The comptroller again, Peter Mynarski. Any questions? Motion by, was that Mr. Norton? There's been a motion to accept the treasurer's report by Mr. Norton, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. Item 8 now comes before us, approval of BET meeting minutes for September 22nd, 2009. Comments, questions? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention.
Move from the second.
Moved by Mr. Crumick, second by Mr. Stone. Mr. Kelly, do you abstain from that vote? No. 11-0-0.
I never understood that.
You want to do the public meeting closure?
Yeah, we'll do that now. Before we get to item 9, the officer's report, it's at least 6:59 now, so why don't we, while the public hearing is still open, why don't we,
Move the
why
individual
don't we
item.
close the public hearing? So let me ask one more time. The public hearing remains open for the Community Development Block Grant budget for 2010. Is there anybody in the audience who would like to speak on that item? Okay, then, is there a vote to close the public hearing?
I move that we close the public hearing.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington,
Second.
second by Ms. Barton. All those in favor?
Aye.
11-0-0. The non-routine applications now come before us. Mr. Stone.
Mr. Chairman, first is CD1, and that's the application to use $1,173,151.54 for purpose of the CDBG entitlement. And I so move.
It's moved by Mr. Stone,
Second.
second by Mr. Simon. Mr. Stone, why don't you also just move
This is-
CD2 for...
This is essentially, CD2 then? Fine.
Please.
Okay, CD2 is slightly different. That's a application to use the amount of $251,004. Also, it's a HUD entitlement, but it's slightly different. This falls into the area of the stimulus funds, and specifically, it's to be funding our reconstruction of a sidewalk in the area of the Hamilton Avenue School. And I so move.
Moved by Mr. Stone,
Second.
second by Mr. Simon. Discussion first on CD1. Princess, would you like to just come forward, if you may, just to give us a brief overview and before we vote on this item?
Of course. Good evening. And item number 1 is it's the annual application to HUD for 2010 Community Development Block Grant Funds. I had discussed this with the Budget Committee, and I'm here to answer any additional questions that any of you may have.
Mr. Simon?
So, came up in our caucus. We just want to make sure that we understand that we're only voting for the 2010 budget as on page 79, I believe.
Yes, sir. You're approving the budget for the
And what
community.
is, and we're not doing anything other than just looking at the 5-year plan?
Yes, sir.
We're not accepting it, we're just,
The 5-year plan is going to be approved by the RTM, and it's part of the application for the 2010 Community Development Program,
but we have nothing to do with that part of
No.
it.
unless you have comments.
Other questions? All those in favor of CD1 signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions. 11-0-0. CD2 now comes before us. Was proposed by Mr. Stone, second by Mr. Simon, and this was for approval to use of the 2009 CDBG recovery funds for the sidewalk. The sidewalk runs sort of from,
From across, or from in front of Armstrong Court all the way to Hamilton Avenue, St. Rox. And this is essentially just an additional funding, since we are an entitlement community during program year 2008, when the 2009 Stimulus Recovery Act was signed, we were automatically entitled to receive $251,004, and we decided to fund this sidewalk, so it's an area benefit as opposed to individual direct benefit.
When will, I see the Commissioner of Public Works is here, Amy Siebert. This would start in the springtime?
Right. We're doing the design right now, and ideally, we would do construction in the spring.
Further questions from the board? Mr. Simon?
So we're going to move, I propose we're going to move this into the Z fund, not the B fund? Because it's really, the B fund is for bonded items, and this is really a capital. This is adding money to an existing capital project.
Yes. Want me just to discuss what Larry's referring to for the rest of the meeting too?
Does anybody need further clarification of that?
No.
So, so practically though, we're not, normally when we vote, we have those numbers before us, so for purposes of this vote, we'll have to say to be amended by the Finance Department?
Well, we're just changing the B to a Z.
You're changing the code. The B is for bonded projects only, capital project. The Z fund is for non-bonded, where it's financed either by pay-as-you-go through the mill rate. He just changed it in one letter, the B to a Z. You're voting on that account. Everything else is the same.
Any objection to that amendment? Hearing none, we'll accept the amendment. Further comment on the underlying item. All those in favor of CD2 signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. Thank you both. Item now comes before us. Officers' report. Mr. Stone.
Nothing, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Madam Clerk.
Nothing, thank you.
Since our last meeting, I've had the privilege and pleasure of meeting with several of our key decision makers in town. Had a meeting with the Commissioner of DPW along with the Assistant Commissioner. Had a meeting with the Comptroller separately, then with the Assessor and the First Selectman. It's also come before me that as a result of Jim Lash's letter to the editor, for lack of a better term, I've been approached by several BET members individually requesting that at the very least that the BET look at this item as to where the tax collector should appropriately be and how we allocate funds for that position. And I think the only reason that I'm stating that at this point is what was told to me was they wanted to make sure that this item came before this body before the election so that there was no challenge that this was politically motivated by one party or the other, and that they felt that it was important that at the very least we get out in front of this, and that at this meeting, which is the last meeting before the election, that we say that that we at least will look into it. And I think while I can't guarantee that because this body has not taken any action on it, I can say that several members have expressed an interest in it, and that I suspect that at least it will be a topic of discussion going forward. So I think it's properly on the table and on the table in advance to not only the candidates but the public at large.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Norton.
On that issue, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding on the table of organization, the tax collector actually is under the controller. Is that correct?
Treasurer.
Is it under the treasurer under the table of organization?
Yes.
Is that a change? Point of information. Is that a change from the past?
On the organizational chart?
Yes.
No.
Because I don't ever recall the treasurer having direct management role over the tax collector.
Practically, you're talking about.
Well, it's the first time hearing about it, which is, it surprises me.
Wait, I thought the question, well, can you repeat the question?
Actually, under the table of organization, where does the tax collector appear?
Currently, he's by himself.
Right, it's an elected office.
It's an elective office, right, but I believe on the table of organization, it appears under somebody's, and I thought it was under the controller.
No.
I don't think so.
No, okay.
Anyway,
that
this
was
is
the question I
why
asked.
we'll have this discussion at a later date, and, but I think it's important that we, at least members have expressed to me that we get out in front of this.
Excuse me, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kremick?
Also, historically, this board at various times has addressed the issue of whether the tax collector position should be an appointed as opposed to an elected position. Obviously, if it was an appointed position, it would be slated into the MC of an appropriate spot. It's never been touched by us because it has remained an elective position. At least that's my understanding.
To be continued. December 9th, I believe, is the first CIP committee. November 9th would be the first CIP public hearing. That will be the first chance the public gets to comment and review on the proposed capital improvements projects process. And that is all I have for you this month. November, as you can already tell, will be filled with presentations. Not only will we anticipate having the senior tax relief issue before us, we'll have the reval issue before us, and we'll have a presentation from the Finance Department regarding some other projects that are coming before us. So it looks to be a full meeting in November. And then I would also like to advise you that Mr. Simon has been working diligently on the 100th year anniversary, and that is December 9th. That's where I got the December from before, starting at 6 o'clock. Invitation should be going out, and you may be getting a call just to follow up on some addresses that we have. We are inviting all of the BET members that we can find, unlike other years, to help celebrate the 100 years. Item 10 now comes before us, old business. Item 11 now comes before us, new business. The first item to come before us is an update of the Nathaniel Witherell Project Renew. And here tonight is a whole slew of individuals from Nathaniel Witherell. I would suspect first of which will be its chairman, Dave Ormsby, and chairman of the Nathaniel Witherell Building Committee, Mr. Fox. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. I would like, if I could, to also introduce Alan Brown, who's with me this evening, in the event that the members of the BET have not met him. Alan is our new executive director who began work on August 31st of this year. Alan has got more than 30 years of experience in the healthcare, skilled nursing, rehab arenas, and has certainly hit the deck running. He comes most recently from Smith House in Stanford, which I'm sure most of you know is the only other municipally owned nursing home in the state of Connecticut. So he's got a background of dealing with the government of Stanford, and we'll quickly find that transferable to dealing with the town of Greenwich, I'm sure. Alan.
Welcome.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. This is the beginning of my 7th week, so I'm still in my getting to know everybody stage, but I have met a couple of you already, and I'm looking forward to working with everyone as time passes. I did hit the ground running. I'm sure some of you have heard. I know there was an article in the Greenwich Time about the Department of Public Health inspection, which happened on my 4th day of work, and we did quite well, and in fact exceptionally well on that. And so it's been a busy time. We had only a few findings, which is much more. It's much better result than the average in the state of Connecticut, and we're looking forward to holding that kind of performance through into the future. So again, I'm looking forward to working with all of you, and it's nice to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. As usual, I have in the back row Ray Augustine, our Director of Finance, and Lloyd Bankson, who chairs the board's Finance Committee. If I may, I'd like to take about 5 minutes to give you a historical update on where Project Renew stands, and then turn it over to Andy, who can tell you what the Town Building Committee has been up to really over the last 2 years. Let me also digress to say that, or report that the Nathaniel Witherell has operated profitably for the first quarter of the current fiscal year. It's an improvement of about $204,000 over the comparable period a year ago when we did not operate profitably. Our census at the moment is about 95.2%, which is ahead of our budgeted census of 95 for the fiscal year 2010. We are dealing with a process which really began in 2002 when a certificate of need was filed by really the predecessor board of directors for a project which would have involved raising the existing Nathaniel Witherell building, dropping the number of licensed beds from 202 to 190, and demolishing the existing facility. That certificate of need was granted in December of 2004, so it took a little over a year to procure the certificate of need for that prior project. But we're dealing with essentially three major components of Project Renew: our administration building, which was built in 1933, our west wing, which was built in 1960 and which houses 52 of our beds or residents, and then our five-floor tower, which was built in 1975 and which houses 150 of our residents. In May of '07, the RTM appropriated $7.3 million for planning, design, and improvements to Nathaniel Witherell. $3.6 million of that $7.3 was allocated for a construction manager and architect's fees and other preliminary costs. That appropriating resolution went on to say that the Nathaniel Witherell Town Building Committee shall determine those items to be implemented. On November 13th of 2008, the town hired the SLAM Collaborative, which is a Glastonbury, Connecticut architectural firm, which, by the way, had worked on the Greenwich Hospital. They've worked on the University of Connecticut buildings in stores. On the 15th of December of '08, I appeared before you and represented that the architect would not begin a design process until it had received some direction from the Nathaniel Witherell board. It had begun so-called schematic drawings, which precede the actual design development drawings. On January 26th of '09, the Nathaniel Witherell board approved a person-centered care model for Project Renew, which essentially divides the building into 12 households, 6 neighborhoods, and 2 communities, and organizes the households around a staffing model which allocates to each of those households a cadre of staff. The general purpose of this is to empower residents to treat the facility in which they're housed as less an institution and more a home environment. And we've begun, as you know, initial steps in that direction with a change in our dietary delivery system, where residents have a voice in what time they wish to eat their 3 meals a day. In February of '09, the board approved a business plan reflecting this person-centered care model and a 30-year long-range financial projections, which were delivered to the finance department and to the BET shortly thereafter. On October 14th of this year, just last week, the town hired Turner Construction Company as the construction manager to commence the pre-construction work. The finance department, as you know, has hired the Health Dimensions Group of Minneapolis to evaluate the reasonableness of Project Renew, the board's assumptions, and the projections which are included in our long-range financial presentation, and also the projected construction costs of the project. That same firm, Health Dimensions Group, had evaluated the prior project back in 2004. The Nathaniel Witherell and its staff have spent from March through September responding to a variety of requests for information by the Health Dimensions Group. Those deal with everything from staffing models and financial models to financial operating results to comparative industry data, clinical information, and the work that the architects have been doing initially on schematic drawings and more recently as they get into design development work. And a tremendous amount of information has been delivered to Health Dimensions Group, both in paper form and electronically. However, since the original submission of our long-range financial projections in February, there's been some important developments have occurred. The first is that we have completed our fiscal year '09 operating results, which ended in June 30 of this year. It gives us a different base year from which to make a 30-year projection going forward, and it seems to us that it makes more sense to use those actual results rather than the prior year of '08 on which our February projections were based. In September of this year, the Connecticut legislature adopted a 2-year state budget which freezes Medicare reimbursement rates. As you know, about 60% of our residents at Nathaniel Witherell receive Medicare reimbursements as their sole source of support. Medicaid, sorry. And our rate of about exactly $243.42 a day under the Medicaid program falls about $58 short of what it costs us to deliver a day of care to our residents. So that's an important and adverse consequence to us. At the same time, effective October 1, the federal Medicare program reimbursement provisions relating to so-called RUG scores, which are the 33 or 34 acuities which are priced out under the Medicare program, and we are reimbursed depending on the care that our short-term rehab delivers for those acuities, were amended, and that too has adversely affected our federal Medicare reimbursement levels. On a more positive note, the town-wide freeze of salaries for the year fiscal 2010, which affects nearly all of our employees at Nathaniel Witherell, has a positive impact on the projections that we had previously delivered. As our architects went forward with design for Project Renew, which will include replacing the existing power generation system, which is quite antiquated. Has identified energy savings opportunities, which we think ought to be reflected in a revised set of financial projections. We also will have, as a result of the shift in the staffing model for Project Renew and the number of additional rooms that particularly single rooms that implicates for Nathaniel Witherell, and that number really goes from 26 existing single rooms to 72. That implicates in the maintenance and the housekeeping areas the staffing required to clean and maintain more rooms than are presently at Nathaniel Witherell. We think that obviously should be reflected in the projections as we go forward. Finally, we have received from the Comptroller's Office a revised debt amortization schedule covering the period of time that Project Renew is being built and will be paid for. All of those have been integrated into a new set of 30-year financial projections which replace or supersede the financial projections which were delivered to the Finance Department and to Health Dimensions Group in February. Those are dated October 9. If you haven't seen them, why, you'll see them shortly because they were turned over to the Finance Department and also to Health Dimensions Group on the 9th of October. On October 27th, we have a team from Health Dimensions Group who are arriving at Nathaniel Witherell to talk to virtually everybody in the building, as far as I can see, about everything from clinical issues to financial issues to staffing models to the status of Project Renew. We have had updates at every Nathaniel Witherell board meeting since this began from the representatives of the Town Building Committee. Andy has appeared at several of the board meetings. Paul Toretta, who was his co-chair, is also a member of the Nathaniel Witherell board. The board has 3 representatives on the Town Building Committee. Our executive director is an ex officio member of that committee. So I think it's fair to say that the board as such is in almost perfect sync with the Town Building Committee on the progress that they have been making. It is our plan to restart, if you will, the certificate of need process. That can be done at de minimis costs, and unlike the prior project, we plan to do that in-house. Because the prior certificate of need was never utilized and was effectively withdrawn, we've been assured by the Department of Social Services that there'll be no fee for refiling that process. Mr. Crummock, I guess, has a question.
My question is, for the certificate of need, what level of architectural drawings do you need?
Well, I think Andy can address that better than I, but I'm led to believe that about 20% of design drawings are implicated or required for the Department of Social Services to commence their processing of that certificate of need.
So with the money that you already have, you have the ability to proceed with your certificate of need?
We do. I should add, too, that the issuance of a certificate of need does not obligate us to proceed with Project Renew, but we cannot commence construction of any significant form without a certificate of need. Mr. Chair.
Mr. Kremick.
As part of the certificate of need process, though, isn't part of that you negotiate a rate with the Department of Social Services, which will be helpful in determining what the going forward
Medicaid reimbursements will be.
That is correct. There is a so-called fair rent value negotiation which occurs with DSS, in which they determine how much of the construction costs properly support the Medicaid side of our operations. And there's a negotiated process by which we finally conclude what the Medicaid reimbursement rate on the capital that has been employed in this process is going to be for on a going forward basis. But I think commencing this process, and you commence it by filing a so-called letter of intent, which simply announces that you propose to file a certificate of need, gets us in line and creates a queue, which we are in. Historically, there have been instances where DSS has shut down the certificate of need process, and I think it's important for us to be in line in the event that budget considerations result in some action of that sort. In fact, some of these implementer bills that have been implementing the budget that are weaving their way through the state legislature have dealt with questions of whether the freeze should apply to applicants who hold a certificate of need, or what the status should be. So I think I'd rather be in the line than outside looking in. But my suggestion would be to let Andy address the town building committee's perspective on this, and then we're obviously both free to take any questions you may have.
Mr. Randy Fox, who's co-chair or chair of the building committee?
Co-chair.
Co-chair.
With Paul Toretto. Just to give you a brief update, we've worked for the last 2.25 years. In fact, we've had 41 meetings on this building committee. As David previously stated, $7.3 million were appropriated in May of 2007 for 3.6 of which is for design construction manager costs, 3.7 is for priority items which were identified for emergency repairs. Also, those costs were assuming we were going to start construction in 2009. Our committee is very focused on how we're spending those dollars. In fact, we rejected the first round of architects' bids, which cost us 6 months in the process, but it saved the project $700,000 in fees. We had an extensive RFP process for pre-construction services, which we also believe we saved a good deal of money. We've contracted last week for an energy modeling program, which will help us determine which is the right mechanical plant for this and use those numbers in the long-range plan for operating cost. We also contracted with a firm to help us go after stimulus money, grants, energy rebates, and we negotiated a $10,000 fee, which is not payable unless they return $10,000 worth of credits or rebates. So essentially it costs us nothing. To date, we have not had to spend any money on emergency repairs. All those have been picked up through the standard CIP process through the Nathaniel Weatherall board. To date, we spent $465,000 of the $3.6 million allocated. David said we've hired the construction manager for pre-construction services. That construction manager, as well as the architect and a third-party estimating service, estimated the preliminary schematic design documents, and they are all within 1% of each other. That current budget right now is $28.7 million. which is 1% of the budgeted money that everybody has seen. For everybody's notice, 52% of those dollars are for long care patients, 21% towards short-term, 24% for common areas which support both long and term care patients, and 3% on site work. The current project is phased over 8 phase periods, which is around 28 months. And in one 4-month period, we can house 192 residents, which is 95%, so it meets the long-range plan, so there's no impact on the revenue during the project. What are our next steps? As David indicated, we've met with the board of directors, and they are in with current status of the plans and budget. We are hosting another review session with the board on Thursday. It's our intent, we would like to get everybody sign off on those plans at the end of the month and start submission process for permits, which include planning and zoning, inland wetlands, and other town regulatory agencies. We also will assist the Nathaniel Witherell Board with its request for certificate of need. At the same time, we'll begin to update the other RTM committees and other town departments. We intend to complete the design to development documents by the end of the year, and then re-estimate those documents by the 3 firms to confirm that the project is still within budget. If those budgets are still in line, then we intend to proceed with the construction plans and specifications, secure final approval of the plans and specifications for the board, and start getting the final approval process for the balance of funding. We will then, after the plans are completed, go out to bid with subcontractors and establish a guaranteed maximum price, of which then we can get final funding approval. Over the next 10 months, to get through that process, we'll spend around a total of 2.8 of the $3.6 million. In order us to keep on schedule, we need to keep going on design. Town permitting process will take 6 to 10 months. The design development drawings will take 3 months. Construction documents will take 4 to 5 months. And then to bid the project will take 2 to 3 months. And if anybody has any questions, that's kind of where we're at.
First, thank you. I know Mr. Ormsby was here back in December of '08 to give a presentation. I think that was helpful at that time. And I think the major concern from our board isn't necessarily sort of the nuts and bolts of where you're going along. I think that was very informative and helpful into understanding where it is that we're in the process. But Mr. Fox, how do you or do you change your timing and process based on the fact that HDG is here in the end of October, and it's anticipated, at least right now, that their report will come out in December, hopefully validating the long-range business plan of Nathaniel Witherell. Are you taking into account that that plan hasn't rolled out yet and been vetted and won't be until December? Or does it not at all affect your planning purposes from the building committee side?
I think it definitely affects our planning, but since our budget, which was validated at the schematic design, was in line what was submitted to Health Dimensions Group, we are continuing down the path. If our budget was above that number, we would then be value engineering and reevaluating the design process.
Okay, so just so I understand it a little bit better, so the fact that Nathaniel Witherell's long-range building committee validated the original amounts.
Correct.
You're proceeding as is, in anticipation that HDG would also then validate what Nathaniel Witherell had indicated, which goes back to the original numbers, which means you don't have to value engineer like we're hearing about relative to, say, the high school auditorium.
Correct. And also, the level of drawings right now are schematic design. Until we get design development drawings, which are roughly 25 to 30% of construction documents, the budget can move. And I want to make sure that we are budgeting with the appropriate amount of documentation. The project is a total renovation, and we are validating that budget.
You indicated that to date you've spent 460 of the 3.6.
Correct.
How much more do you think you'll spend between now, or since the 460, through, say, the end of the year, or through when that HDG report comes out? So let's say, for argument's sake, it's not till the end of December.
We should spend about another $500,000 through design development, and then the construction documentation is about 1.5.
So we're looking at, just from a taxpayer standpoint, we're looking at spending $1 million to get us to the point where HDG will hopefully be validating the long-range business plan when you're having your documents ready for the DD documents.
Correct.
Engineering want me to Turner Construction escalation.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of the scheduling is that right now our budget assumes starting in the fall of 2010. As people know, the economy has been relatively flat. Our construction manager, in fact, has budgeted this at flat escalation, somewhat negative, little de-escalation, but nobody knows what 2011 or 2012 will do.
One last question, then I'm more just asking factual questions now to Mr. Stone. So when would you be seeking your certificate of need? I guess that's more for David.
Well, I think we'd like to commence the process by filing a letter of intent tomorrow. Under DSS procedures, they have 10 days within which they decide, in which they must send us the CON application forms. And then it is a case of completing those forms, getting them back up to Hartford, along with everything that those forms require.
But those forms, if I heard correctly, require the DD documents?
Correct.
Okay. So you wouldn't actually be filing the final submission until sometime by the end of the year?
Yes.
Mr. Simon?
I just was going to follow up on the CON process, which to me is the key element of making this building financially feasible. And the state can take months to make this decision. And will you be working and proceeding while the CON process is occurring? Or will you put yourselves on some kind of hold? Because they may want to make changes.
Typically, the changes are of not an architectural nature. They're generally a financial discussion, and I think Alan could answer that question better than I.
The actual CON process has a time constraint for the state. What can slow it down is if the state determines that the application is not complete. Once the application is complete and deemed so by the Department of Social Services, they have a specific amount of time in which to rule one way or the other. So it's really, incumbent on us to file a complete application that requires as little questions as can be anticipated as routine, and then for us to respond on a timely basis to any questions that they have. So let's assume that from start to finish, that's a 6-month process. By the time you file the letter of intent, by the time you file your application, and to the time you actually get an answer, it's going to be more than 6 months. So what do we do in the interim? Do we move ahead? Do we wait? Because without the CON, we can't build it. Without getting the appropriate fair rental value, we can't build the building.
Correct.
So what do we do while we're waiting?
Well, I would think you would evaluate where the CON process is going, because construction documents take the same amount of time. So the question is, do we want a 6 or an 8-month delay in the project start before you start the final construction documents, and then escalation could take an effect, or do you go in parallel?
That's exactly the question. Now,
That's
what's
the
the
question.
answer? I mean, that's a difficult question.
I think that the answer is not crystal clear tonight. I think we want to set it up so we can go in parallel if we're getting the right feedback from Health Dimensions and from the state.
Mr. Stone, then Mr. Crumick, then Ms. Tarkington.
Andy, or one of your colleagues, you've obviously plugged in the numbers that you've received from the state and the federal government as far as the reimbursement, expected reimbursements going forward of Medicare and Medicaid into your business plan. Right. And those have been basically reduced to a new business plan, which has now been submitted to Health Dimensions. Health Dimensions is only to, from our standpoint, to validate what your plan and conclusions have been. And without getting into the specifics, do those new numbers still reflect a, quote, going concern?
Yes, they do, Mr. Stone. I think the principal effect of the myriad of adjustments that we've made in the revised projections take the cumulative cash flow down from $25.2 million to $12.3 million. That's cumulative over a positive cash flow over a 30-year period. It without question, reduces the cash flow over that period.
But still
of time.
a positive.
But it is still a
positive margin.
Positive over a 30-year period.
Good. Thank you.
Crumick, and then Ms. Tarkington.
My experience in obtaining a certificate of need is a little dated. It was when I was chairman of the Board of Social Services, and we got a certificate of need for renovating Parsonage Cottage. But as I recall, at that time, it was very important for us to go parallel the certificate of need process and the MI process. In other words, to move the project along on a zoning and land use approval front. And it would seem to me, because you don't want a situation where all your numbers are, you have a gap where you're not going, the project's not going forward, and suddenly your numbers go off. Because as we all know, in most cases, a construction project delayed does lead to an increase in costs. But I would think that you would want to, during this period, after the certificate of need application is filed, as you're developing drawings for the certificate of need process, you're also, I would assume, want to go ahead with your land use approvals, so that during that period, you'll have that. And I must say that one of the things that when we were negotiating with the Department of Social Services,
one of the things we had to show them was MI approval, because it showed the municipality was committed to the project, and they thought that was important. Because you have a unique project the same way we did when we did Parsonage Cottage, because we're a public, it's a public institution, and they're not used to seeing that.
I indicated that with those design development documents in November, we want to start the entitlement process with planning and zoning, inland and wetlands, municipal improvements, and other departments.
Ms. Tarkington.
Yeah, I had a question. It may not be for you, Andy. It may be for Mr. Ormsby. I'm not really sure. The 20% design documents. You know, I go back to the first CON, which was received by the town. I don't remember 20% design documents having been completed. It seems to me that those approvals were sought and received without, you know, really with more schematic designs. If you remember, there were very few drawings on the buildings. And so the question on the 20%, you know, is that current, and how does that compare with what the town was able to achieve on the previous CON receipt?
In our RFP process with the architects, we asked them to put down the amount of dollars to get a certificate of need, and in those responses, it was design development documents, which equal about 20% of construction documents.
Well, perhaps since the town did it previously, you know, we should go back, someone on the board should go back and find out if that was really needed and how it was achieved the last time, because I believe that it didn't go that far in terms of the design documents.
Well, that's what we requested from the architect, who has done several certificate of needs with the state.
Mr. Kelly.
Did I hear you say that you were given $3.7 million for emergency repairs and none has been spent?
That's correct.
Can we get that back? So
I
that's
have
money
no
that's...
idea. Rhetorical question?
It's rhetorical, yeah.
I mean, I don't...
The answer is it's authorization to spend. We haven't borrowed it.
Okay, all right, that's all I wanted to check. Just wanted to see if we had.
Mr. Ormsby, do you have a general sense as you stand here tonight as to when you would come to the BET and then the RTM for construction money? We talked about it for the last couple of years, that it didn't necessarily have to be part of the budget process, but obviously as this project starts to really take shape and people can have a better sense of where we're headed with this, I suspect that during the budget process it's still going to be discussed. And so at a minimum, I suspect that the Budget Committee would like to talk to Nathaniel Witherell about not only their budget, but Project Renew, at least in part. But when would you be coming before the BET and then the RTM for construction?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I would like to come for the BET as soon as you've had a chance to digest the Health Dimensions Group report, and on the assumption that it doesn't thoroughly discredit everything we've done to date, why we'd like to sit down with you and get your assent or your concurrence just as soon as possible, because it obviously has a bearing on the parallel track that the town building committee is on. And if it's if the stars are not in alignment and for any reason there would be a negative decision, why I'm a taxpayer of this town too, and I don't want to spend any more money on a project that is not going to move forward than anybody else. So that I think as soon as you have digested and are prepared to discuss the results of the Health Dimensions Group study, why we'd like to sit down, I assume initially with the Budget Committee, but then with the full BET and get your review and endorsement of the project.
So as it's planned now, just as sort of as an FYI, I think Health Dimensions is planning on being here in December to issue their report. Obviously, there'll be a lot of work between the October 27th date and then our December BET date, but the comptroller is...
The plan, it's two steps.
after the October 27th interviews, and they take everything back with them, digest it, they wanted to come in December for a PowerPoint presentation, which would be, they would also take questions and answers, and issue a final report in January.
Okay. So, obviously, and we'll send out a directive to make sure your board is aware of that so that they're on the same page of knowing what HDG has said so that we can, obviously, if your board also has questions, I guess that would be the appropriate time as well before a final report is issued in January.
Well, I would hope that as they proceed with the drafting of this final report, that they consult with us if there's a massive disagreement on any of the assumptions or we've made a mathematical error. I would hope we could work collaboratively to produce the most informed and intelligent report to you that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope here is that HDG helps validate what Nathaniel Little has produced, and if it can't for some reason, that we try to find solutions. Because obviously this is an important project. We have yet to decide whether or not to fully go forward, obviously, with the funding for the construction of it. But already a lot of money has been appropriated for this. Money's being spent. I guess it's being spent every day, and I appreciate your comments. Knowing that the project hasn't been fully funded yet, and there's a lot of parts of the equation that still need to be filled out. And so that's why this board asked both of you to appear here this evening, and I certainly appreciate it because this is a large and very important part of Greenwich. And I think we just want to make sure everybody's on the same page going forward. With that, are there any other comments? Well, great. Thank you again for attending.
Thank you. Thank you. That's your pen.
The next item to come before us under new business, the approval of the retirement board investments. Jim Lavin, he was here. Oh, sorry, missed you. Retirement board administrator. Good evening.
Yes, good evening all. This is an application to get the BET approval of investment that the retirement board wishes to make in some real assets. The real assets are two index funds, one of Treasury inflation protection instruments at the so-called TIPS, and also a commodities index fund. As you probably know, the retirement board reviews the portfolio every spring for its asset allocation, and this spring, and upon recommendation of its consultant, NEPC, it voted to commit 3% to the TIPS index and 3% to the commodities index. At that point in time, that dollar amount was approximately $7.5 million. We have the documents from State Street Global Advisors. I've presented some of our consultants' recommendation here for you to get a feel of the board's discussions on this matter. It went through your normal process, your law committee and your investment committee. And as you may know, we have a new chairman, Mr. John Chadwick, who is with me tonight, and at this point in time, let me stop and see if you have questions.
This item did go before the Investment Advisory Committee. I believe that was in their report. Would either one of those members wish to comment on this?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm willing to comment. Although I supported the request in the Investment Advisory Committee for these two investments, I have some concerns about each investment. Number one, they're both private investments. They're not public investments because State Street Bank Advisors is actually a Massachusetts bank. They're under the jurisdiction of the Banking Department of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, so that although they are similar to products that are quite readily available in the public market, these are not public investments. And the second concern that I have, which I have expressed in the committee, is that there have been changes to the investment objective of each fund in the past 11 months. The Treasury Investment Protection Securities, commonly known as TIPS, had a change effective November 24, 2008, in which the fund, in the discretion of the trustee, may invest in units of bank commingled funds maintained by the trustee in amounts in proportion the trustee believes will provide a return that will replicate that of the index over time, which in effect is stating that the trustee will have the complete discretion as to invest in things other than tips and products through bank commingled funds, especially those maintained by State Street, that they expect will replicate the performance of the TIPS index. And the second fund, the Dow Jones AIG Commodities Index Non-Lending Fund, on June 5th, 2007, again, the trustee made some changes to the investment objective in which this basically becomes a derivatives fund, which again is intended to replicate the performance of the index. I just think that this board should be aware that going forward, both of these funds, which are private funds and which we cannot have access to as to what the positions are at any one time, you're totally dependent upon the semi-annual reports issued by the sponsors of the fund as to what is included in the fund. The fund's composition could be extremely different from what it was in the last report that was made.
Mr. Finker?
Those points were raised in our Investment Advisory Committee meeting, and Mr. Chadwick, who attended the meeting, indicated that he was aware of the amendments and also pointed out that while the retirement board may be spending up to $7.5 million in each of these funds, those funds were not necessarily locked in for a long period of time. On, I believe it was 30 days' notice, the retirement board could take those funds out of the particular investments if they found that they weren't achieving what their intentions were.
Other questions or comments? Mr. Levin, is there a concern that relative to Mr. Norton's questions regarding the fact that the material or primary objective of these two funds has changed?
Well, he's consistent in expressing that concern, and we're paying attention to it. Clearly, the retirement board will look at this every month. It gets reports from its consultant regularly. This is a 30-day contract that either party could end. The money is priced daily, and I believe we could even get the money out on much shorter notice than 30 days if we saw something we didn't like going on. That is consistent with many of our other contracts, which 30 or 60 days we could fire managers. We have fired a few already, and move the monies to more safer index funds for that if there's a concern on that. So that's a valid point, and that'd be something we would be monitoring as we go along.
The vote of the retirement board was unanimous on this?
Yes.
Mr. Simon?
It would be helpful to have Mr. Chadwick speak and say where these investments fit into their overall strategy of asset allocation and why they chose these particular investments.
Well, I'm John Chadwick, and I'm chairman of the retirement board. These two investments both look at what is more than anything else going on in the economy right now today, and that is that we, I think, are very concerned about the possibility of a real increase in inflation brought about by the tremendous amount of money that the federal government is pouring into the system and not taking any of it back out. And while inflation has been moderate to low in the last year or so, looking to the future, we believe that we should begin to make some changes in the portfolio in order to guard against that. And typically, with the portfolio that we've had in Greenwich, we have been invested in various index funds, which are sort of riding along with the market. Now I think it's time for us to grow up and take some steps up the ladder here. and one of them is to say that the board sees something coming that it thinks cannot be captured in a typical index fund, and therefore, in order to guard against some inflationary pressures in the economy, we want to make these two investments. TIPS themselves are simply a way, is a product. It's not a product, it's a bond which the government has issued, which guarantees you a rate of return over and above the rate of inflation. They have a very long life to them. They are not being issued anymore by the government, and so to some extent they are becoming a rare and rare species. I think that is one of the reasons why State Street moved to change some of the underlying constraints that they had put into the original prospectus, which said only that the fund could only own TIPS. I might say, by the way, that if we are concerned about State Street overseeing these assets, of our $282 million, $92 million of it is lodged with State Street. So I'd be perfectly honest, the fact that they are not a company that is here in Connecticut, but rather is headquartered in Massachusetts, doesn't particularly bother us. And if it did, we would have more serious things to worry about than these two particular investments. In addition, we have a blanket relationship with State Street, which has a myriad of funds that we could invest in. We happen to have our investments in 3. These are 2 more. We thought it would simplify the whole process, particularly legally for the town of Greenwich, if we simply picked 2 more of the funds that they had available and used those. And so all the legal department really had to do was to look through the documentation for these 2 funds as opposed to the overall guiding document for the whole investment. I digressed a little bit. So TIPS have been around for a very long time, and as I say, they give you a guaranteed rate of return over and above the rate of inflation. Clearly, as inflation starts to go up, the price of bonds goes down. As interest rates rise to try and offset that inflationary pressure, and that's what we're trying to avoid here by the ownership of the TIPS. As far as the commodity index fund is concerned, there are basically 2 ways of owning a broad group of various commodities. If there are 2 indexes out there, the AIG index, you may have noticed in the work that we gave you, has about 30% of their portfolio in the energy sector. The other one is a Goldman Sachs index, which has, I think, Jim, close to 70%, if I remember correctly, in energy. We did not think it would be prudent to take on the extreme volatility of changes in oil, which would drive the second index all over the place. And so we have selected this one particular index. I think if you look at what's been going on, I don't think anybody knows that the price of oil is up $10 a barrel in less than 6 weeks' time. That reflects not so much the demand for oil as for the weakness in the dollar, but nevertheless, that the world is sort of reigniting itself, in our opinion, and beginning to come back. And demand for energy and commodities is steadily rising once again in China, India, other places in the Far East, and Brazil. That begins to put pressure on the prices of not only oil, but copper, or I should say metals in general, as well as agricultural products. That is going to begin to flow through into the U.S. economy, unfortunately, one day, and I think anybody who goes to the filling stations right now knows what's gone on in recent times. How are we going to guard the pension fund against that? How are we going to, more than guard, how are we going to take advantage of the fact that commodity prices start to rise as the world economy begins to recover from the problems of 2008 and 2009? Now, this is one way of doing it, and we think it gives us a nice broad approach into into the commodity markets at a very minimal risk. The instruments which Mr. Norton has described, I can tell you from having run many mutual funds in my lifetime, are part of what often gets put in a prospectus to give the manager as much leeway as possible. The reality is that oftentimes they never get used, and in some of these products are actually of some value because nobody ever wants to take physical delivery of the underlying commodity. And that's why they are used too. As Jim Lavin said, I think we have more access to what's going on in these two portfolios than something that we would get every 60 days, or every 6 months. And our ability to sell these two investments is really overnight, as far as I know, and we don't have to wait to some other particular point in time, like 30 days later, in order to get out of them if we decide things have changed. And I think things will change. Things will change because the surge in inflation will be behind us, and we'll want to move on and get out of these. It's not because that we'll find something inherently distasteful in either of the two products.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? Mr. Campbell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chadwick referred to the Law Department reviewing the documentation, and the Law Committee did review the documentation of both of these proposed investments. The Law Department advised us that the documentation consists, as I think you referred to, of an amendment to the existing agreement with State Street Global Advisors, and it does not change the fiduciary and indemnity obligations of that existing agreement. And so with that, the committee voted 2-0 to approve the documentation as to form and legal order.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Very good. All those in favor of approving both of these investments, at least on the application, it's RF1, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for coming. The next item before us is the approval of budget guidelines for fiscal year 2010 and 2011. Ms. Tarkington, as clerk, if you could just get this item before us, as Mr. Mason is not with us this evening.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm presenting the budget guidelines as was voted 3-1 in the Budget Committee special meeting on October 8th. Minor grammatical changes. I guess a couple of them occurred at the Budget Committee meeting on October 13th. As you're aware, the members of the Budget Committee worked with the Controller and the Budget Director over the summer, and they had a first read at the Budget Committee. And again, there were a couple additional meetings, and all BET members had the opportunity to provide input. Again, I so move to bring this forward for approval.
It's been moved by Ms. Tarkington.
Second.
Second by Mr. Simon. Just so that I want to make sure everyone's working off of the same document, my understanding is that we should be working off the document at the bottom left-hand corner, which is Guidelines Draft 7B as in boy, or BET. Okay. Very well. The way we'll proceed this evening is my understanding that there are a couple of requested amendments, and so I would ask that we take those up individually, and I'll simply ask for a motion with a second and ask for comments with respect to any of those, and then at the end, if anyone wishes to make a brief, I'll say brief again, general comment about the guidelines, I would certainly entertain that at that point before a final vote. So if you just have general comments about the guidelines, I would ask that you hold off on those until the end, and I will afford anyone the opportunity to make comments at that time. So Maybe we just do this by page. Are there any suggested changes or amendments to page 1? Page 2. Mr. Simon.
Two changes on page 2. Under mill rate guidelines, the 6th sentence, it should say the budget is projected to increase by 5.7% instead of 6.1 to match attachment A. Say that again?
So it currently reads 6.1,
The 6th line,
and you would amend that to say
5.7, which matches the
5.7%.
numbers on attachment A. I think attachment A changed and the guidelines didn't. That would be, I'm looking to Roland, that's the correct number.
Is there any objection to that amendment? Hearing none, we'll adopt it by unanimous consent.
All right, second is on the first bullet, second line, says these 47 people represent annual savings of over 4.1 million. I would change that to read these 47 people represent annual costs. I guess cost should be plural. Annual costs? It's really, they represent a cost of over 4.1 million, not necessarily a savings.
So striking the word savings to cost.
Yeah, it should be plural.
Yes.
An annual cost?
Well, the word annual is right there already.
And the cost of the town.
Say that again?
It's a two-part, my understanding is it's a two-part amendment. The first is the word "and" between the words represent and annual, and then instead of savings, to cost.
All right.
Is there any objection to that amendment? Hearing none, we'll adopt that by unanimous consent.
Cost is singular, right?
Yes, so when you put an
Okay.
N, it has to.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, before you go any further, I don't want to have any misapprehension on this. I obviously have expressed some reservations about the overall guideline as drafted, and I don't want to stop this discussion or prevent general votes on amendments to this draft, but I clearly have several fundamental reservations which are going to be reflected in my voting nay, and I can provide some specificity now or in general comment areas later on.
Why don't we wait till either general comments or
That's what
even
I
at
thought.
that point, if you have a specific amendment, we'll come back to
That's
it.
fine.
Very well. Any other amendments to page 2? Hearing none. 3?
I have one change.
Mr. Simon?
The fourth bullet, the senior tax relief is currently in the fiscal year 11 budget project for 735. At the end of the next sentence, after the word information, in parentheses, putting, it is estimated that $1.1 million is required to fully fund this program. It's just that members of the board felt that there should be some understanding where we wrote in the sentence above that the amount given is not sufficient to fund the program, to at least provide some clarity as to what is required to fully fund the program.
Just so I'm just going to restate it for the purposes of our secretary and clerk. After the word information on the third line of bullet point 4, found on page 3, it would be parentheses, it is estimated that $1.1 million is necessary?
Well, I use required. I'm not sure there's a difference, but I would trust your judgment.
No. I'm just trying to get it on before us. Required to fully fund the program.
This program.
This program. And parentheses.
Mhm.
Is there a second to that?
Yes, I second that.
So, moved by Mr. Simon, second by Mr. Raymer. Discussion on that?
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Campbell and then Mr. Norton.
I'm just reading this right now, or trying to make sense of this proposed amendment language. The subsequent sentence says, any increases in this program must be offset by additional savings within the budget. If I read now the new parentheses language that's before us, then I'm afraid that it would seem to indicate increases beyond the 1.1 million would have to be offset by additional savings within the budget. I did not think that was the intent of this bullet. I thought the intent was that any increases beyond the 735,000 must be offset by additional savings within the budget.
Yes, Mr. Simon?
Yeah, I agree with you, no matter whether we added the, so I would change it to be any increases in this budget projection.
Instead of program?
Yes, because it's really not an increase in the program, it's an increase in the budget projection. Whether we have what's in the, whether we include what's in the parentheses or not, I think we should make that one change.
We have another motion on the floor, sir.
Oh, hold on, Mr. Norton. Mr. Raymer, do you agree with that modification?
I adopt that modification.
All right, so so does anybody have any objection to that modification? All right, so now the modification is the parenthetical that we previously described, and now the words budget projection in place of the word program after the word this on line 3 of bullet point 4 found on page 3. Mr. Norton.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, and I object to the language because the language, as I understand it, says an estimate, and I don't think that that's appropriate language in this document, especially in this paragraph.
Okay. Any other comments or Ms. Barton?
I prefer the language that Mr. Simon has moved to what is currently in the document, but my strong preference would be to have the $1.1 million estimate for the senior tax relief program reflected in Appendix A, where it belongs.
I would second that motion as well.
Well, that's not before us unless you want to.
Well, we have them in a little bit of the reverse order, because if the language that Mr. Simon just proposed is adopted, it will just have to be changed again if we then adopt a suggestion that the updated estimate be included in Appendix A. That's why I raised the question now. I'm not sure if it's properly a motion at this stage, but the two are closely interrelated.
I don't disagree with you, but I think it's at some point there
If you would like, I'll make that motion.
Well, I think we should make that motion at the time that we get to Schedule A and take it up at that time, because I think the two could be separate. Okay. Somebody could vote for this and not that, or the second but not this language. Ms. Tarkington and Mr. Raymer.
Yes, I'm unfamiliar with where the number $1.1 million came from. It seems to be approximately a 10% increase over last year, and I think we won't and don't understand how seniors' income will be affected. I think last year we had basically the fourth quarter of the year in their income and the market devastation, I guess. This year I think it's going to reflect a full year, so we may find that there are more applicants. You know, again, I'm just not familiar how the 1.1 was computed, so therefore, you know, if we'd been advised this in advance, it might have been more familiar to me. Thank you.
I didn't understand the gist of that comment. Does she want to modify this or not?
No.
No.
I think it was Mr. Raymer.
I was merely going to echo the remarks of Nancy, that if you're going to address the $735,000 figure in Appendix A, you're also going to be amending the figure as it appears in this fourth bullet point. You wish to be discussing that when we get to Appendix A instead of discussing it now?
If it gets approved, we'll move it back. We'll revert back to this line.
Fair enough.
Any other thoughts, Mr. Finger?
Just to comment on Mr. Norton's comment about the 1,000,001 number being only an estimate and therefore maybe not appropriately placed here. Although the word estimate is not used in a lot of the other locations within the guidelines are replete with estimates. So I'm not sure that if we use the word estimated at $1.1 million really is something that would preclude us from having a number that is quote unquote an estimate in this bullet point.
Any other thoughts or comments? Mr. Kremick?
This is the bullet point where we talk about savings, that if this program is fully funded to that estimated level, that we'd have to look to savings. It seems to me we should add to that or revenues. As I recall, part of the reason that the senior tax credit was not fully funded last time was that there was a drop-off in revenues. And we may very well and hopefully will get back some of those revenues. So I think to be fully fair, that it's not only cost savings, but there also may be more revenues that may lead to the full funding of the program.
Well, similar to the last one, that would have to be a motion adopted unanimously by Mr. Simon and Mr. Raymer, and then I suspect we could take it up as that. If not, it'll just be...
I move to amend it then.
We generally don't amend items, but I certainly would allow you to offer it up as a further motion to further amend that paragraph.
Well, at the appropriate time, if you would recognize
Fair.
me, I would like to do that.
Okay. So just before us, unless there are any other comments, is the parenthetical that I will not reread and the striking of the word program being replaced by budget projection. Does everybody understand where we are? Okay.
Yeah, but I thought we did the budget projection unanimously.
No, that was just unanimous consent to the motion by both Mr. Raymer and by you. So all those in favor of this motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Can you raise your hand just so I can get them down? Mr. Raymer, Mr. Finger, Mr. Simon, Mr. Krummick, Ms. Barton, Mr. Campbell, and Mr. Kelly. All opposed? Norton, Walco, Tarkington. Everyone voted? Mr. Stone, you abstained?
I think I'll abstain.
Very good. 7-3-1, Mr. Stone abstaining. So that passes. So, Mr. Krummick, you would like to add the word after savings and revenue?
Or revenues. Or revenue.
Or revenue.
Revenue.
Got it.
I second.
Hold on, just so I can get a counting of this. Motion by Mr. Krummick, second by Ms. Barton. Discussion? Mr. Simon?
Yeah, the problem with the revenue part is that the budgets as presented to us, generally the revenues are more under the control of the finance department and not the people that submit the budget. And we generally don't allow those submitting the budget to change the revenues. So they have less control over that. I mean, I don't object to the word revenue, but I just don't think it says, puts the same onus on the first selectman to choose how they want to pay for this program. But, if you're going to propose revenue, I'll still vote for that.
Further discussion? Mr. Krummick?
Not to touch on what I've already talked about, but we do consider revenue certainly when we're doing this, and although the guidelines are issued for the guidance of departments, we consider them, and we have in the past considered them in our deliberations. But it's quite clear that what we're asking from this language, we are asking the first selectman, if this program is to be fully funded, the first selectman has got to go back and has got to look through the whole budget and submitting it to us to come up with a means of funding this. And I think we are putting the onus where it belongs on the first selectman to come up with the financial wherewithal to fully fund this program. And clearly, we, in our budget projections, are not so far coming up with that number. But we are putting the burden on the first selectman. I don't think the OR revenues, I think that is a more fair and complete way of describing the situation.
Further, Mr. Campbell.
I was comfortable voting for the previous amendment that we just supported, part because I think it's simply an honest statement of what an estimate is at this time to fully fund what we know about in the ordinance. But I also voted for it because we also have a directive right after it that says that any increases beyond the budget projection must be offset by additional savings. And I think that is the directive that we want to give. It's certainly one that I support. So I would oppose adding the language that has been proposed.
Further discussion? Well,
just to Mr. Crumick, shouldn't it be increased revenue? You were talking about additional savings have to be found if we're going to do it, and don't we have to have increased revenues in order to do it?
You mean as opposed to additional revenues?
Additional revenues, you know?
Probably increased is a more accurate way to describe it. It would be additional services or increased revenue.
Right, I mean, if we're going to take revenue.
Additional services, sorry.
Savings.
That's my wish for the future, but I'll hold that back. Additional savings or increased revenue, so I'll adopt that amendment.
All right.
To be more grammatically correct.
Ms. Spartan, just to be,
I'm fine with that.
thank you. So now, barring any other comments, I'll put this item before us. The question is to add the words "or increased revenue" after the word "savings" on bullet point 4, page 3, last line. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Wait, that's not where it is. It's in the sentence above it.
Any increase in this program must be offset by.
I thought it was increases. I thought it was in the third line.
It is the third line.
Yeah, it is the third line. Well, to be consistent.
I thought he said it was at the end by the offset by additional savings, and it was at the end.
Well, to be consistent, it should be in both places.
So the sentence would read, any increases in this budget projection must be offset by additional savings or increased revenue within the budget. Similarly, should a senior tax deferral program be introduced, this will also have to be offset by additional savings or increased revenue?
That's correct.
Yeah. The different
Ms. Spartan?
programs.
Yes.
Hold on a second.
It's not redundant because there's two different programs, right? Okay.
Far be it from us to be redundant.
No, not with 9 lawyers. How could we be redundant?
Okay. Any other comments? All those in favor of this, which is our fourth amendment to the budget, placing the words "or increased revenue" twice in the bullet point regarding senior tax relief, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
So it's and Mr. Stone, I take it you're abstaining. It's 6-4-1, 6 in favor, 4 opposed, 1 abstention, the 4 against, Norton, Tarkington, Walco, and Campbell. Mr. Stone's abstaining. Okay. Any other amendments, proposed amendments on page 3? Page 4. Page 5. Mr. Simon.
Second, well, the first paragraph after the bullets, fourth line, says assumption will be validated by a consultant, and I would propose changing that to assumption will be assessed by a consultant.
I'll second.
So that's by Simon, second by Mr. Kelly. It's to change the word on the first full paragraph underneath the first two bullet points on page 5 from line 4, validated to assessed.
We'd like him to actually look at it and assess it, not necessarily rubber stamp it.
Is there any, can this be adopted by unanimous consent?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly, I'm glad you agree.
Well, this end down here, Jim and I have actually agreed on this.
Excellent, all right.
Well, we agree at this end, too.
We'll accept that by unanimous consent. Moving on, page 5.
No.
Page 5.
I have a series of proposed changes to the section headed capital. I can describe to you generally what they consist of and then give you the words. I do not agree with listing the 11 capital projects that have been pulled out for separate consideration in this year's budget guidelines. They come from the 15-year capital plan. They, in many cases, involve outdated or probably invalid cost assumptions. They've never been, with rare exceptions, vetted by either the Budget Committee or the full BET. Something is going off in my ear. And I object to including them. I can now give you the precise language if you like, or just make the motion that we delete the reference to the 11, whichever
Which would come along with other relevant
which would
changes
come
to
along
the...
with implementing changes to make that happen.
Fair enough. Why don't, does anybody mind sticking with that generalized motion at this point, and then if the specifics are needed, we'll get them.
I'll be happy
Okay.
to provide them.
Motion by Ms. Barton to, in essence, remove the 11 listed projects and then make the relevant changes thereafter to the document. Second by Mr. Kelly. Discussion? Mr. Tessie.
Good evening. I would support Mrs. Barton's amendment because I do think as we proceed through the budget process, the specificity of the projects that will be funded really comes through the CIP. These are derived from what's currently scheduled. They're given some order based upon last year's or even the year before's. And I think for clarity purposes, this makes sense because this document is often referenced and the people who are looking at it don't necessarily know how to reconcile against the current. So I think this makes a tremendous amount of sense in terms of keeping clarity in the process.
Sorry, Mr. Kelly.
I happen to like having it in here because I can actually see what are the new projects. And the language before this, in the paragraph before, clearly states that the BET anticipates that some of these projects may be eliminated or substantially changed over time, and some other proposed new structures may be added. So I think the language in the beginning of that clarifies that this is just pulling out for viewing purposes, and so for clarity that we do have 11 new projects that are in the system, the CIP. Whether they will ultimately be funded or not or changed is clarified. So it's just simply a listing of the projects, which helped me anyway. So.
Further discussion? To be honest with you, I see both points. One of the criticisms of this budget process, and it's not just this process, it's that, as I've said before, this document now is over 10 years old, And as the BET tries to better understand and utilize this document, certainly we don't want it to become simply an add-on every year, and it has become wordy. I've heard criticism that it's actually too large of a document. It should be scaled back, and so in part that would do it. At the same time, if you scale it back too much, it's not really a document to offer guidance to our department heads. So I guess in general, I tend to agree with Mr. Kelly about there being some sort of guidance given to where we intend to head with this, some direction. But I think Ms. Tarkenton, you had your hand, and then Mr. Crumick.
Yes, I think given the first selectman's point here, I think that this is something we should consider. Would it be possible, I know it's not in order, but to get some idea of what areas that Ms. Barton had proposed changing here so that we have a better idea of how this particular amendment would go if we proceeded with it?
Yeah, why don't we get the remaining comments, then we'll come back to it, unless somebody has questions about that in particular. Mr. Crumick.
I think that it's helpful for the people to read this document, to have some guidance, to know what are the major projects out there that we've identified. I think it's clear from the language here, we're not saying, that any of these projects are going to go forward. We're not even standing by the dollar estimates, but just for informative purposes and informing whoever reads these guidelines. I think it's worthwhile to keep them in. However, I reserve the right to change my mind depending on Nancy's persuasive elaboration of the reasons why she thinks it should come out.
Mr. Campbell, and then Ms. Barton will go through the specifics.
I would agree with Mr. Crumick. I just wanted to note, I think the point here that certainly got my attention, and perhaps it's what the Budget Committee, I'm not sure if we've heard from them, intended here, was to highlight the relative scarcity of capital funds that are available for new projects, the rather high dollar total of at least these enumerated new projects, and so the difficulty and the long-term nature of being able to fund these. That was the point that I took away from it, and whether it's necessary to list the projects, I don't know, but I wouldn't want that point lost.
Before Ms. Barton gives us her specifics? Okay, Mr. Norton and then Mr. Simon.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I do support deleting them, and I think it makes a great deal of sense because you can read these and misunderstand whether we're talking about specific projects or the CIP process, which I believe is what is our document that really drives our capital expenditures. So that I think by deleting them, it emphasizes the value of the CIP process, and I think that's really what we want to emphasize. And by listing these projects, many of which might or might not get funded going forward, it can create confusion as to where are we going, meaning where is this board going with its guidelines.
Mr. Simon.
So we included this part of the capital plan because, there's most of the items in the capital plan are reasonably small, and you have a few items, specifically the first 6 or 7 that are quite lumpy. And from my point of view, it gives the CIP guidance excellent direction because they have to focus on, if you take out these 11 projects out of the existing capital plan, you focus on what is routine maintenance and vehicle replacement, then you have to make some important decisions on how you're going to spend the rest of the money. We can't do everything at once, and you have to, and I'm trying to say in here, we don't necessarily have to prioritize among routine maintenance because we have enough money in our capital plan to do the routine maintenance and the vehicle replacement. We don't have enough money to do routine maintenance, vehicle replacement, and all these new projects at the same time. I don't think the BET should be willing to sacrifice the routine maintenance that we've been focusing on for so long, or the replacement of capital, and that the CIP committee has to think about it in those terms. Here's the things we need to do to maintain our infrastructure. Here are the things that we would like to do to build our future. And there's different sets of money, essentially, at least in my mind, available for those two different objectives. And that we don't have enough money to do the public safety facility and the auditorium and the new Board of Education building, and that they have to make some decisions and think along those lines. And I put these projects in there so someone would have an understanding of where the $103 million came from that was taken out of the Schedule C, which would then also have to be redone. And that's why it was there. It was not intended to say anything about the 11 projects. It was just to point out that we have projects that are falling into different groups, and from the CIP committee's point of view, this is what they should be thinking about. And if they don't want to do any of these projects, then they can do other projects.
Mr. Raymer?
Before we get to Ms. Barton's particular changes, if it is a useful middle ground, I might offer that if you were to go to the bottom of page 5, the very last word, and change the word will to would, so it's in the subjunctive, and then over the top of page, not quite the top of page, I'm sorry.
Oh, hold on. The last
word appearing on page 5 is the word will. If you change that to the word would, so the sentence is in the subjunctive, and then if you went to the sentence that precedes the 11-item list, and you said there, after the word the 11 projects, if you inserted there, used for modeling these projections, you would make it a little clearer that you are working with something which is something of a hypothetical, not necessarily an expectation that all 11 of these will be done. And by doing that, maybe we serve both purposes. We have the specificity that Mr. Simon was talking about of showing what were the projects that we were looking at when we offered these figures. And at the same time, we honor the first selectman's concerns about putting forward a list that then might be misunderstood as being more concrete than it's intended.
I'm going to toss that back to Ms. Barton to see if that would.
Well, the would be cured in one of my proposed deletions from the guidelines, which we haven't gotten to yet. And I remain opposed, for the reasons I stated earlier, to listing the 11 specific projects. Whether we call them a model or just list them, to me, is immaterial. And
Fair
so
enough.
I do not share Jeff's suggestion, although I'm happy that someone is thinking about ways to accomplish this.
Okay, so we won't amend Ms. Barton's proposal at this point. It's still before us, fully appreciating that Mr. Raymer has a potential alternative if it does not pass. So at this point, let me ask again, Ms. Tarkington, you had requested the specifics relative to Ms. Barton's proposal. If you would like them at this time, I would ask Ms. Barton to give them, but it's up to you. Or if anybody else would like the specifics of Ms. Barton's proposal.
I think it would be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you.
Ms. Barton?
On page 5, under the heading capital, in the fourth line, the word 11 before the phrase 11 capital projects should be changed to several. Several capital projects in the fiscal year 10 capital plan. I would then insert aggregating over $100 million. That's for Jim Campbell's point, I hope. Have been segregated, then the rest of that remains the same. The sentence at the very bottom of page 5 that begins with the words "the financing model," start deleting there and continue deleting until you get through the list of 11. And then the next paragraph would require a conforming change to say, a key part of the CIP program will be deciding the order in which to change these 11 into new construction, to implement new construction projects. Delete the remainder of the sentence and add the words "within budget constraints." Yes, that's it.
So the only thing I would point out is it says this project list. Sorry, this project list on the next paragraph.
Oh, yeah.
So,
That would have to be, these construction projects do not include.
okay.
Well, we would write the capital financing model.
Hmm?
I would write the capital financing model.
Does not include, right.
Spartan, are you okay with
I'm
that?
okay with that, yes.
Hold on. Okay, so, does everyone understand those changes? Further discussion? All those in favor of Ms. Barton's amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Mr. Campbell, Ms. Barton, and Ms. Tarkington.
Mr. Norton.
Barton, Norton, Campbell, Tarkington. Opposed? Abstain? 4, 6, 1. Mr. Raymer, are you proposing your amendment?
Yes, I'll repeat it for the sake of clarity. The very last word appearing on page 5, I would change the word will to would, so that sentence is in the subjunctive. Over on page 6, the paragraph that presently begins, the 11 projects, I would propose to add words after the words 11 projects. The words I would propose to add are used for modeling these financial projections.
Bear with me a second. It's been moved by Mr. Raymer. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Campbell. Replacing the word will to would and adding the words used for modeling these financial projections after the word projects on page 6. Discussion. Mr. Simon.
I think the wood is a good choice. I don't think we're modeling the financial projections. All we're taking is the existing model. We're not doing any modeling here. We're just taking a series of projects, a set of numbers, and depicting them. It's a model that shows, but we're not using model as a verb.
I would gladly delete the word modeling with no objection from me. I don't know about the second. So it reads, used for these financial projections.
So say this, the 11 projects,
Used for these financial projections.
I mean, I don't care. I mean, it seems redundant because all we're talking about is the capital financing model.
I have no objection either way.
Okay. The word, well, the word would is still there. We're not on there.
Maybe we could just do 2 motions.
I'm going to withdraw my second if I can, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure what I seconded at this point.
I think the wood is a good choice.
What is good? Let's start with wood.
Okay, how about this? Unanimous
wood.
consent?
What
Is
is
there
unanimous?
unanimous consent to the word would?
Yeah, with
Excellent.
subjunctive.
All right, hold on. Raymer, Camel, unanimous consent. That was change number, or vote number 7 on the budget. And Mr. Raymer, then for the 8th proposed amendment, you would like to offer after the word projects used for these financial projections?
Yes, that would be very satisfactory to me if there's a second.
I'll second.
Second by Ms. Barton. Discussion.
I mean, I don't see that it adds any clarity to the guidelines.
I
mean, what else are we talking about but in the section, but the model in attachment C?
I don't see the clarity, but if it helps one person understand that these are projections and not projects cast in stone, far be it from me to stand in the way of redundancy.
11
So
projected projects? We're not going to say that.
anyway,
Could we just read it one more time?
Sure. The 11 projects used for these financial projections in descending dollar amounts, descending dollars, it should be dollar amounts? Yes. Dollar amount order with their 2009 dollar estimates are.
How about used in this financial projection?
Mr. Raymer?
I adopt that too.
Ms. Barton?
That's fine.
Used in this financial,
Yeah, that makes more sense.
Yeah.
okay.
Singular projection, correct now?
Yes.
Okay.
Is that by unanimous consent?
It is down.
Unanimous consent. Okay. Page 6.
Oh, no. Oh, yeah. Okay, six.
That's what we're
You're
on.
still on six. Okay. But that next paragraph really should be changed. Just a couple words. We have
Which next?
the key part of the CIP program will be deciding the order in which to implement these 11 projects. That's, that's confusing now with our language, so it should be something like, we'll be deciding whether to implement these 11 projects or any other projects that may occur.
Just delete it. Delete the whole sentence.
Delete the whole paragraph.
Yeah, that's good, yeah.
Delete it.
Either way.
Delete the whole sentence.
All right, hold on.
So who
I
moved
want
that?
just to make sure, go through the chair. So is somebody making a motion?
I'll move to delete it.
Let him go first.
Mr. Norton, what do you
Move
move?
to delete this whole sentence.
The sentence starting a key part?
Yes. I'll second that.
But you're also telling him about the money that's available.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, so that's important, right?
Told them that already, several times, several ways.
It's motion by Mr. Norton to delete that portion of the page 6, starting with the key part. A second by Mr. Kelly?
I had seconded it, but.
Oh, Mr. Raymer, I'm sorry.
No, because I need the 22 and 29 in there. I need to show that.
I agree with that. I withdraw my second.
Yeah.
Is there a second to Mr. Norton's motion?
No, he's out.
Okay, we'll move on. No second.
So what did we end up doing?
Nothing. There's no,
Well, I
Mr.
think-
Mr. Kelly?
I would make a motion that the word whether be substituted for the order.
Hold on, where are you? Are you still?
I mean, a key part of the CIP program will be deciding whether to implement. So I would put in whether, and I would delete the order in which.
Is that the only change?
Yeah.
That's a change. Let's change, proposed change 8 by Mr. Kelly. Is there a second?
It tells you when you can start, if you have this much money, it tells you how long.
Second by Ms. Barton.
Project.
The change is, it would read, a key part of the CIP program will be deciding whether to implement these 11 projects, parenthetical, with 22 million available in the first 2 years and 29 million more available in fiscal year 13 and fiscal year 14. Mr. Mr. Campbell and then Mr. Simon.
I'm not sure that works, because I think the point of the sentence now is that with a certain number of funds available in those years specified, decisions have to be made about order. I don't think it makes sense then to change it to whether to implement the projects at all with that funding available in those 4 years. And I'm not I don't think it works.
Mr. Finger?
Yeah, I'm not in favor of it. Also, we are being redundant, and I refer everybody back to the initial paragraph on page 5 for the capital, and I don't think it could be any clearer. 4 lines from the bottom, where it says the BET anticipates that some of these projects may be eliminated or substantially changed over time, or other proposed new structures may be added. To me, that's already stating what the attempt of this motion seems to be. So I think it maybe confuses the issue even more so. And I think the guidelines are pretty clear in the section that I just read, that there's a lot of flexibility and leeway in projects that are listed and not listed.
May I respond?
Mr. Kelly?
My problem is, it says the CIP program will be deciding the order in which to implement these 11 projects. It sounds like a fait accompli. So, and that's my concern.
I see your point.
I think the whole thing should be eliminated.
Yeah, there's another.
That's not the problem with the sentence.
Would it,
Steve, or
Hold on,
Mr.
hold on.
All right, okay. I'm very flexible.
Weighing the implementation.
could you put parenthetical after the word and deciding the order, then parenthetical, or even whether?
But just weighing the implementation.
Mr. Chairman,
Ms. Barton?
an alternative would be to leave it as it is, except cross out these 11 and insert the words new construction. These and any others.
I'll take a slight change to that. I think she's on the right path.
Mr. Kelly, I heard you before. Did you still want to speak?
Not anymore. No. There's
So
like 4
does somebody
hands
want to
raised.
take a crack at this just to move it along? Mr. Finger?
I mean, I'll try it.
Well, let me try reading the sentence, and people can chime in whether they think it helps or not. A key part of the CIP program will be deciding which projects to implement, with $22 million available in the first 2 years and $29 million more available in fiscal 13 and fiscal 14.
That's fine. That's fine. Simple.
Say that one more
Don't
time.
do that again.
The right side thinks you've hit a home run here. I see Mr. Crummick's hand still up, so I'm a little
And a
apprehensive.
lot of people on the left side are
to just
saying you read that again. So
Claim victory here. Hold on a second, hold on. Mr. Crummick?
I don't think the CIP program decides anything.
Well,
I
that's the
think
word
they
we're
make
getting rid of.
recommendations. And it seems to me that that's what they're doing. They're making recommendations. So my objection is to the word deciding.
Mr. Finger now.
if I try it again, a key part of the CIP program will be deciding.
We'll be recommending.
Will be recommend which projects, will be to recommend which projects to implement with 22 million, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, so the approval has just moved over one more space here.
And I have one change to his.
Hold on. Mr. Simon and then Mr. Norton.
So instead of recommending, I would put in the word prioritize.
Sounds like it's done.
Well, they need to prioritize. They just can't recommend we do all the projects. They have to prioritize them in a way that fits within
Some
the
might not
capital
be done.
model.
We don't necessarily.
How about recommend in priority order?
So we're not just, you're assuming they're done then?
First of all, they only recommend it to us. We then get to decide whether or not we're going to fund it.
How about Wayne?
And they need someone, part of the CIP process has to be saying, here are these projects or new projects, and here's the priority order in which we're recommending that we fund them. And you're going to see that throughout the budget package, throughout the financing plan. They should not leave the room until they decide where they want these 11 projects or any new construction projects to be funded. That's what they need to do. They need to come up with a new plan for us. The current plan doesn't work.
Okay, Mr. Norton and then Mr. Finger and Mr. Raymer.
And, yes, the problem I'm having is, to me, it implies that the 22 million available in the first 2 years is a commitment, and the 29 million available in fiscal year 13 and 14. And if that's a commitment, I don't think that that's appropriate to be here.
Mr. Finger.
What we're saying, as I understand it, the CIP program, the CIP committee recommends projects for the particular fiscal year that they're meeting.
In priority order.
In priority order. So what I think the intent here is to say that based upon what we're laying out in these guidelines, we're saying there's $22 million that's going to be available in the first 2 years and $29 million in 13 and 14.
How do we know that?
We know that only because that's the way we've projected out our financial model, our capital plan. So inherent in that, it seems to me, is that when the CIP committee is meeting, they will know that there's only a finite number of dollars available to them, and the requirement that they have is to come up with the particular projects that they want to put forward, that they recommend be put forward in this budget, and the order in which they are put in, so long as they stay within that dollar guideline that we're establishing here.
Mr. Rayner and Mr. Crumick.
If I can offer once again some gentler language that might solve some of the concerns. If the language were to read, a key part of the CIP program will be the weighing of the implementation of, and then it goes on, these 11, so we're getting away from whether it's a recommendation, whether it's a commitment. It has a gentler word than the words that were offered before.
Mr. Crumick.
I don't agree with that because I think that is not clear what weighing means. But if you actually put, if you actually put the recommending, the language that was just proposed, and you added "and their priority," because they're doing two things: they're recommending and they're recommending priority. If you put "and their priority," it'll convey what we want to convey to the CIP folks.
Mr. Finger, I would ask that if you could read that with Mr. Crumick's addition, just for the sake of, I'm not suggesting that you're adopting that, I just want to make sure everyone understands where Mr. Crumick is going.
Mr. Crumick could repeat what he just said.
He's adding.
After your language, just add "and their priority" before the dollar numbers. I think it works.
I think after the word recommending. Right.
Then it'd be prioritizing, perhaps.
How about recommending the priority in which all capital projects should be?
Well, wasn't it recommending the projects, right?
Well, there are a number of ways. It could be a key part of the CIP program will be recommending which projects to implement
And their priority.
and their priority
Right.
with 22 million.
That's good.
Maria, do you have that? Okay. That's Miss.
If Maria would like, I can try to read it again.
A key part of the CIP program will be recommending which projects to implement and their priority.
And keep going with 22 million available.
22 million available in the first 2 years and 29 million more available in FY13 and FY14.
That sounds good to me, yes.
Wait, that was originally a motion by Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
And then,
I accept the amendment.
and second by Ms. Barton.
And I accept the amendments.
I second all the.
Okay. So, Mr. Finger, thank you for doing the work of Mr. Kelly and Ms. Barton.
Mr. Kelly appreciates it too, Mr. Finger.
Do they owe me something?
Any other discussion?
I think the record should reflect I'm also doing their work.
Mr. Crumick, I hope you come back several times and visit us after your... All those in favor of this amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 1. 10-0-1.
No, 911.
911, who was opposed?
Yes.
Mr. Norton opposed, sorry. Any other changes to 6? Page 7. Page 8. Page 9. Ms. Barton?
I have to find it on the page, but I move that the line under mill rate calculation that says, where is it? It starts with town senior tax relief, is now shown at $735,000. I move that be increased to 1.1 million.
I second that.
Moved by Ms. Barton, second by Mr. Raymer. Discussion. Mr. Campbell.
I would oppose that motion. I think it contradicts the language that, and obviously that's where we're going back to with this, that we adopted. Starting on page 3, fourth bullet point, the senior tax relief, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's important that we recognize that that we were at 735,000. That if we're going to increase it, that's going to require change. That's going to require additional savings, and I realize now, despite some negative votes, that it's now going to read or additional revenues. And I think it's important that we keep it at the 735,000 number right now in the budget.
Mr. Raymer.
It seems to me the budget guidelines for what we're proposing for the upcoming fiscal year ought to have the figure that most closely approximates what we think we're in fact going to want to budget. And with both of the candidates for first selectman, as I understand it anyway, proposing senior tax relief, probably at this level, it seems to me that we should be proposing a figure in our upcoming budget that matches that anticipation.
Further comment? Mr. Finger.
I'd just like to point out that if we were to make that change, the only net effect, at least on this Appendix A, would be that the last dollar amount on the right column, being amount to reach 3.5% increase, would just be a larger number. So it's not like these projections using the 735 get us to a particular or a targeted mill rate. The mill rate that we refer to as the historical 3.5% increase needs to find an additional roughly $4.6 million somewhere, as it's currently stated. So making that change would only increase that number by whatever the $300,000 amount.
Other comments? All those in favor of this proposal to change on Schedule Appendix A, the 735 to 1.1, is it?
Yes.
$1 million, signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Mr. Raymer, Mr. Finger?
No, I did it.
Mr. Kremick?
I joined the principal tree.
Ms. Barton? And Mr. Kelly? Opposed? Mr. Norton, Mr. Simon, Mr. Walker, Ms. Tarkington, Mr. Campbell, 4, what is that?
I'm sorry, could you go through?
551.
Campbell.
Okay. That fails. To Amendment A. Attachment B. Probably should read appendix.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, hold on. So unanimous consent for Appendix B as opposed to attachment? C is an appendix as well. Is that okay?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, Mr. Raymer, hold on one second.
I'm sorry, did someone move that? Steve, did someone move that?
I just asked for unanimous consent, if that was a problem. With a change in page 8 to clarify. We'll clean that up, Maria and Roland. I guess there's a reference to attachment B. It should be appendix B on page 8. Okay? Thank you. Mr. Raymer.
Yeah, I was left a little uncertain with where a 551 vote leaves us when it's an amendment to guidelines that have not yet been adopted by the board. It's not as if we have adopted and now we're weighing an amendment and the amendment didn't get a majority. We don't have an adopted document at this point, And so I'm not sure, I really don't understand, actually, where a 5-5-1 vote leaves us.
Protocol of this board is if you don't have an affirmative vote to change the document that's presented by the Budget Committee, it fails unless the chairman is willing to cast the tie-breaking vote in favor of that. I chose not to do that in this instance. It doesn't have enough positive votes to sustain itself, and therefore that motion failed. Any other changes then to the document? Okay, so as amended, and there were 10 at least voted upon amendments. Some, you have 11? I'll go with Maria's number. We have 11. I didn't count Mr. Norton's that didn't receive the second. Okay, so good. We've got that at least. I will now entertain either generalized comments or more comprehensive comments for a vote, but I would ask that if you're proposing anything in a comprehensive nature, that it be at least specific enough so that we can vote on it. So with that, any comments on the budget guidelines? Mr. Barton?
I have an additional suggestion at the bottom of page 1, since I believe there are 1 or 2 dissenting votes on the guidelines, that the last sentence of page 1 be deleted.
The whole, I'm sorry, the whole paragraph?
Well, the whole paragraph could come out, but I would certainly insist on deleting the section that says, although some of us differ, we join in presenting, because I don't think that's going to happen, if I am reading the tea leaves correctly.
So your request is simply to delete the last sentence?
Yeah, I did. But last year, we were
I would
agreeing.
second that.
Hold on. Ms. Barton, can you restate your motion, please?
I move that we delete the last sentence on page 1. And for clarity, I don't object if it's a majority vote of the BET to saying the first sentence, that it represents the current directional thinking of the Budget Committee. It clearly does. And the BET as a whole, which if there's a majority vote, it will. But not all of us, I don't believe, are going to join in it.
Moved by Ms. Barton. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Campbell. Discussion.
Chairman.
Mr. Campbell.
I second the motion just because I don't think it adds much. This is language that is here from last year. That was an attempt, I think, to establish a compromise that we could all agree on at that time. And to say that although our membership may differ on many of the individual assumptions, hardly gives a great deal of clarity or unified direction to anyone reading the document. So I'm not sure that adds much. And the preceding sentence does make the statement, the BET as a whole, and I think that's what's understood when we adopt these budget guidelines. So I'm not sure we need to say any more after that BET as a whole ending there. And so that's why I support Ms. Barton's motion.
Further discussion. Mr. Finger.
I concur with Jim. I don't think it adds anything. And while we're guilty of redundancy, I don't think we need to be guilty of fluff.
Our side agrees.
Further discussion.
It sounds like a general consensus.
Is this by unanimous consent?
Yes.
Yes.
So be it. Unanimous consent. Further generalized comments on the budget? I'm sorry, let me just, any others? Mr. Stone?
Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm delighted to have heard some of the discussion, a fair amount of the discussion tonight, which really indicates that you're focusing on the fundamentals to a degree. Anyway, I'm afraid, though, you've danced around the deck chairs in the Titanic on this one. And what I'd what I'd like to see done, and I do it in the form of my expected, predicted, and in the prescient eyes of Ms. Barton, expected vote against the proposed amended draft, is to come up with a couple of suggested changes that would have allowed me to go along probably with the remainder of this draft. And that is that I wanted to see a cap on this year's mill rate increase of no greater than 2%. Quite reasonable given the national, regional, and clearly local experience that we're having from a standpoint of inflation, both over the recent past and where it's expected to be. Recognizing that a growing number of our citizens, very definitely including the seniors that this board is properly focused on, but many more than that, having increasing difficulties given the current and expected financial conditions that are prevailing. And I think we owe them a more reasoned product than what is currently being outlined. What we have here is unfortunately, it's a validation of a model which, when it was first designed some 5 or 7 years ago, it was flawed, deeply flawed, on some specific assumptions that I made comments about at the time in terms of assumptions on revenue in a number of areas, building permits, conveyance tax, some frankly absolutely outlandish expectations as far as future capital expenditures, what's turned out to be wildly overly optimistic expectations as far as continued experience of the retirement fund. And mind you, that was in the days of the good, what I'll call it, the good days of the markets, which I and many others, I think at the time, said we had no reason to expect that was going to continue. We've now seen for 2 years, and last year there was at least the beginning of a recognition that we've moved away from those salad days. But even though we've now recently broken through some better levels of the major securities indexes, some people out there say it's not unusual given historical trends of the markets to have had a bounce back like this, and it's quite likely we're not going to continue to see improvement, maybe even see a retrenchment. But even if we did, we've got a lot of territory to make up. On the whole, the model, which last year I characterized as a flawed model, should not be revalidated. We really do need to. I think this board owes it to the town, to our fellow citizens, a better look at this. In effect, what it is that we're facing, and you spent an awful lot of time, and justifiably so, looking at the future capital expenditures, even if you give a haircut to a number of these 11 identified projects, there are others out there that haven't been plugged in yet. Yeah, many of them will be eliminated or deferred well into the future, maybe even forgotten. Others are going to replace those. It's safe to say that we're going to continue to have to make sizable expenditures for not just maintenance, but what I'll call improvement purposes. There's a call for it, and I would, if I were on this board in the future, I would support many of those. In order to continue to spend anything like these kinds of money, which, by the way, let me put just some numbers right here. Right now, we have a little over $79 million in bank debt. That's going to be going up next year. If you look at the rollout into the future, that's expected to increase to a little over $124 million. Following a plan that, sure, much of that can be cut, but the point is, and I get back to I'll call it the architects of this flawed model, and I can't speak too negatively about it. At the time we embarked on the borrowing program, it was mentioned in a gentle manner by a prior first selectman that we might have to borrow externally, and that might total $50 million. Sounded like, and it is, a fair amount of change. Wasn't outstandings at any one time of $50 million, which would be serviced and reduced over time. I can't remember tonight exactly within what time frame, but the implication was it would go down to zero within a reasonably short period of time. Obviously, today we're well above the expected outstanding level, and it's quite reasonable to assume, looking at the identified projects and/or others that will replace them, even a fraction of these, we're going to have increased requirements for capital expenditures. Okay. Put that aside. It's important, but let's put it aside for the second. In order to begin to deal with that and to begin to deal with debt that this town can service, because eventually it has to be serviced, we've got to contain, finally, our operating expenditures. We started, and I think we've made some progress, some major progress over the last year or so. In order to continue in that direction, I wanted to see, number one, this, let's call it ratcheting down of the collar from the 4% maximum increase mill rate to no more than 2%. But specifically, I also called for a continuation of a right-sizing program that the town has embarked upon. And specifically the amount of 20 to 30 positions to be eliminated from the table of organization, which need not, absolutely need not, call for the elimination, the involuntary termination of present town employees. We have significantly more than those positions that are currently not filled. But from a standpoint of discipline, I wanted to see those 20 to 30 of these positions eliminated. And over time, by either continuing to face reality, to tighten our belts in certain areas that it can be tightened in, we'll contain the operating expenditures in this town so that we will be able to afford serviceable debt to support the capital expenditures that the town needs to make. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Crumick?
Bob and I agree on a few things. One, I will be voting against these budget guidelines. We agree on that. Secondly, neither of us will be here when you actually put together the budget. Neither of us will be sitting on the board. I think we can agree on that. that's perhaps the extent of our agreement with respect to this. I will be voting against these guidelines, and I'm going to tell you right now, it's a symbolic vote. I appreciate all the hard work that's gone into the guidelines, all the hard work that's gone into the past few years as we've tried to develop a process for anticipating expenditures, for sensible planning of expenditures. My concern with these guidelines is the way that we ourselves are treating them. I am very concerned that when we pass these guidelines, at least for some members of our board, they become written in stone. No pun intended. And that is a concern I've had for a long time. I think this 3.5%, quote, historic mill rate increase that has become kind of a talisman for budgeting has in the past created some problems, and it could create problems in the future. Because like Bob, I think that people are hurting out there, and I think they need relief from our government. But in many cases, the relief they need from our government is increased services or maintenance of important services like the homemaker service, or relief like the senior tax credit. And last year when we set, or this year when we set the mill rate, I believe that was an example of our board treating this 3.5% mill rate like a talisman and not looking to see what we can do for the needy residents of Greenwich. And there are people who require our help and our services. And in budgeting, I think that we've got to look at our services, look at a reasonable cost of our services, and we have to take that into consideration. And if we have a revenue shortfall, we have to leave ourselves open to looking at revenues, not only tax revenues, but a number of these projects, let's face it, are not going to be funded without revenues attached to those projects from other sources. We all know that. We don't say that in here, but that's the reality that we all know. So I'm going to vote against these guidelines, again, in appreciation for all the work and effort and thought that's gone into them, but merely to make the statement that I will not be around to make when you're actually putting together this budget, that we should not restrict ourselves unduly. We should not set budgets by backing into the budget from a 3.5% mill rate increase, which I think has been our tendency, that we have to look at the needed services for the town of Greenwich and the recommendations that we receive from the people that actually provide those services.
Further discussion. Mr. Campbell.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to find something that I can pick from Mr. Stone and Mr. Crumick and agree with both of them, but I find the porridge neither too hot nor too cold, but about right. And I will be voting in favor of the guidelines. I think that Mr. Crumick makes an excellent point that the 3.5% has become a talisman. I think a number of us on the board are concerned that 3.5% may not be the right number. I think there are at least several of us who believe that 3.5% may be too high a number. I think I've even heard that from the Democratic candidate for first selectman on the campaign trail. And at least there have been hints of that coming out. And so I do think we have to be careful not to be too wedded, and I support these guidelines because they do not call for a 3.5% increase. They call for a 2 to 4% increase. And as for my friend Mr. Stone, I do agree that we have to be careful about our operations. We need to look for more savings there. I don't support a hard cap of 2%. I'm not sure that we can get there this year. But the spirit that we should be looking down the scale of 2 to 4 and not up the scale is something that I have in mind when I vote for these guidelines tonight.
Further comment? Very well. All those in favor of the guidelines as amended signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Mr. Raymer, Mr. Finger, Mr. Norton, Mr. Simon, Mr. Walco, Ms. Tarkington, Mr. Campbell, and Mr. Kelly. Opposed?
Nay.
Mr. Stone, Mr. Crumick, and Ms. Barton. 8-3-0. Great. Thank you all. Thank you to the Budget Committee. I know Mr. Mason is not here, but the work that goes into these guidelines is an enormous piece of work. I will say that, as I have said before, I do intend to further revisit the process, because I think while we open it up at some point, we need to also streamline how comments and outside input comes in. So look for some changes and some recommended changes now while it's still fresh in everybody's mind. So if you have thoughts or suggestions as to the process by which we approve guidelines, let me know as soon as possible. But I do think that having 2 months to work it out through the BET has been a good one and has allowed for a greater discussion. Is there approval for the decision day and for the public hearing?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Crumick, second by Mr. Norton. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 11-0-0. Approval of the Early Incentive Program Payout Resolution. That's through our Human Resources Committee. It's as presented to you in the packet. Ms. Tarkington?
Yes. This resolution was prepared really to regularize what's now being done by the Finance Department. This was not to change the policy, but rather to put in place what is a practice for this early incentive program where there was no budget for accrued sick pay and accrued vacation pay. So therefore, excess funds that some of these departments may have in their 100s accounts, either because they're delaying hiring of people or whatever, will be absorbed to pick up some of these expenses. And only after there isn't availability in those Department 100 codes, which I think will be a discussion, obviously, with all parties involved, as it has been, will they then be charged to other locations, including fixed charges. So this really puts in place a practice that's being done today, and it does not change the overall policy, but validates what's being done by finance because there is insufficient balance in the fixed charges to pick up these costs.
It's been moved by Ms. Tarkington.
Point of information.
Let me just get a second. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Norton. Point of information by Mr. Crumick.
This is a first reading of a policy, isn't it?
This is not a policy.
I don't think it's a policy. I think it's simply a request from the HR committee to how we're treating the early incentive retirement program.
How's this different than a policy for how we're handling a financial matter?
Policies would go into our policy manual,
I understand.
right, and be addressed on a long-term basis. This is for a short-term program of how we're currently handling business.
This is currently in the current year because for reasons, whatever, beyond the group on this board and finance, there was no budget put in place in the current budget year to absorb these costs. So this is simply a way to absorb the costs and delay the request for increases to fixed charges.
So it's not a policy because it relates to that specific program?
Right,
I
and
understand that.
it's very short term.
Further discussion, Mr. Simon.
Yes, now when Ms. Tarkington read the resolution, she added a key sentence which is not in here, which is that who's going to review these journal vouchers in the second paragraph, which you referred to.
What's your question, Mr. Simon?
She referred to that it wasn't as if the department was going to exhaust its 100 code and then the finance department was going to reimburse them. she indicated that there was a review step in the middle of this that was not in this resolution. I'd like to know who's part of that review step. Now, I don't know if there is
Well,
a review
there
step.
are monthly presentations given to the HR committee.
So does the HR committee get to review every department's 100 and either approve or not approve whether or not we should reimburse them for this sick and vacation time? Is that what's implied in this?
I don't think it's implied. I think that's, as a matter of practice, once it reaches that threshold, in order to pay it off, we're going to pay it off. I don't think it's an approval process, but it's certainly a review process.
So the HR committee is going to review all of these requests to be reimbursed for the journal voucher. It's going to either approve them or deny them and act on behalf of the BET in that regard?
I don't think they're approving them. I think as a matter of course, they're going to be journal vouchered once it happens.
Okay.
If needs to be a transfer into the fixed charges, then obviously our approval, and it would be the full BET's approval, would go through the Budget Committee in ordinary course. This is simply indicating, my understanding is the first selectman has agreed that the monies will first come out of the individual departments, and then upon a depletion of those accounts, it will come out of the fixed charges. And then at some point, if there's no money in the fixed charges, then in fact, we will get a request for a transfer or an additional appropriation.
So you can almost be assured at the end of the year that the fixed charge account will probably get depleted.
Right.
And that one or more departments will also be short of money. And then what will we do? We'll just transfer money at a BET meeting?
That's correct. Whether it's a transfer or an additional appropriation.
But this is only for these 47 people.
That's correct.
This is not the existing practice. And for everybody else, we're going to use the existing practice
That's correct.
of charging fixed charges first.
Yes.
Okay?
Further discussion? Mr. Campbell?
I'm sorry, but is it grammatical, the second sentence, the yet? Am I missing something?
doesn't
There
read
is
very
a
smoothly, does
grammatical one to fix it. What happened, Jim, is we took out the word only, and it didn't end up being quite grammatically perfect. We discussed it and decided to present it as with that. If you'd like to make a correction to make it grammatically improved.
I'm just not sure, I'm not sure how, I'm not sure what goes after are depleted. I don't know what belongs there, but not will.
It didn't read very well. I didn't know either, but should be, the paragraph should start off with the word only, not after. Then it reads correctly.
No, if it's,
Okay.
if you take the word will and instead of putting it after the word depleted, put after the word leave
Right.
in the second line.
Say that again?
The way the second paragraph should read is after funds in Department 100's object codes are depleted, the excess pay for accumulated vacation leave and/or pay for accumulated sick leave will be issued
Right.
a journal voucher from the Department of Such object code
Much nicer.
to the town.
Well, I like the word only in this.
Only after the funds?
Yeah, only after funds in the department's 100 object codes are depleted will the excess. But, at this point, I'm ready to move along.
We'll make that one grammatical change of the word will.
We're just dropping it down a line and over two?
Right. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 10-0-1.
Who's abstaining?
Ms. Barton?
No, I'm not abstaining, no. I'm moving next.
Discussion, vote to hire a consultant for the Town of Greenwich Board of Ed Shared Services, Building Infrastructure for, this was a Budget Committee resolution of up to $50,000. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Simon, second by Mr. Finger. Discussion? Mr. Raymer?
I had expressed the concern in an email that I had sent to my colleagues that I wanted to be sure the consultant was looking at not just the implementation of shared services, but also the appropriateness of it, to look at whether or not there's in fact a cost savings or whether or not there's a management improvement or both. And that really depends upon the charge that's being presented to the consultant. And I don't know that I've seen the charge. I don't know if my colleagues have seen the charge.
No, the process would be for us to appropriate the $50,000. The thought process being now is the charge will be developed by Mr. Finger, Mr. Mynarski, and myself, and then the selection committee, which is yet to be finalized, but in its draft form would be an individual from the first selectman's office or his designee, whether it's Department of Public Works or what have you, a member of the Board of Ed, 2 members from the BET, and the comptroller.
May I speak further to that?
Finger. Mr. Raymer, sorry.
Well, my concern doesn't arise in a vacuum. In the guidelines, which I won't take us back into, was the suggestion that a consultant is being hired to validate, was the word that we selected and then changed. And then elsewhere, it also appeared as if the consultant was being used for the implementation, but not to advise us on the question of whether we're going to do the shared services. In the dialogue that took place during the last budget committee, there too, the dialogue that was taking place is that we're using the consultant to help us design the implementation, but there wasn't much conversation about whether the consultant's going to advise us as to whether or not we in fact should be doing a shared services program. To the best of my knowledge, though I did receive an email from Mr. Mason suggesting, this is something that we've all assumed was going to be the case for a very long period of time, not during my tenure anyway, although I haven't been here very long, has this board acted upon the question about whether or not we are going to merge these departments. And speaking just for myself, I would like to have the reassurance that the consultant is going to look at the question about whether there should be shared services at the same time as they're looking at the question about how to do the implementation. And I'd like assurance of that before I vote on the proposition, because if the proposition is only, no, we're not going to look at the whether, we're only going to look at the implementation, then it would change my vote to a negative vote.
Mr. Kelly.
I would agree with Mr. Raymer.
Well, I think in part their representation on the RFP drafting, if you want to call it a committee or not, but certainly we're going to be consistent with the guidelines. The guidelines have been changed to assessment. I think that word will be used.
No, I think it's a point well made that Mr. Raymer made, and I think it's a point that the committee should certainly be aware of as they're going through this. And with that, I'm good. All right. We've made the point.
Point taken.
Any other further comments on this topic? All those in favor of appropriating up to $50,000 for the hiring of a consultant to look at Town of Greenwich Board of Ed shared services signify by saying aye.
Aye.
But we're not really appropriating, we're authorizing.
Authorizing.
Right,
Did I say appropriating?
Yes.
All right, authorizing up to $50,000. Signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? 11-0-0. Very good. So moved. Thank you, Mr. Kelly.